Evelyn Shaw never believed in fairy tales, until the moment she saw a stranger's tear glisten in the harsh Montana sunlight. She'd sworn no man would ever set foot on her land again, not after what her father's debts and her fiancé's betrayal had cost her. But when Caleb Mercer stepped off that train with grief carved into his face and a letter she never asked for clutched in his calloused hands, everything she thought she knew about trust, love, and survival began to crumble. This is their story. Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The Montana Territory, 1882, was not a place for the weak-hearted or the foolish. It was a land that demanded blood, sweat, and an iron will just to see another sunrise. The winters could freeze a man solid in his sleep. The summers could bake the hope right out of the soil. And the people? Well, they were harder than the ground they walked on, because anything softer didn't last long enough to matter. Evelyn Rebecca Shaw knew this better than most. She stood on the weathered porch of the ranch house her father had built with his own hands, her arms crossed tight against her chest, her jaw set in that stubborn line that had become her trademark in Miller's Bend. At 26 years old, she'd already buried both parents, watched her fiancé run off with the banker's daughter and half her cattle, and spent 3 years clawing her way back from bankruptcy with nothing but spite and determination keeping her upright. The ranch, what was left of it, sprawled across 200 acres of stubborn land that fought her every single day. 40 head of cattle where there used to be 200. Fences that needed mending faster than she could fix them. A barn with a roof that leaked every time the sky even thought about rain. And a mortgage payment coming due in 6 weeks that she had no earthly idea how to pay. But she'd be damned if she'd lose this place. The wind whipped her dark blonde hair across her face as she stared toward the distant train station, barely visible as a dark smudge against the afternoon horizon. Somewhere in her chest, beneath the anger and the exhaustion, something twisted with an emotion she refused to name. Dread, maybe. Or rage. Her younger sister Clara had done the unthinkable. 3 months ago, during one of her visits from Denver, Clara had sat at this very kitchen table, her pretty face full of concern that Evelyn neither wanted nor needed. "You can't do this alone anymore, Evie," Clara had said, reaching across the scarred wood to touch her sister's work-roughened hand. "You're going to kill yourself trying." "I'm fine," Evelyn had replied, pulling her hand back. "I don't need help. I don't need anything." "Everyone needs something," Clara had insisted, her voice soft but persistent. "You can't carry this ranch on your shoulders forever. What you need is—" "Don't!" Evelyn's voice had gone cold as a January creek. "Don't you dare say what I think you're going to say." But Clara, sweet and naive and thoroughly convinced she knew what was best for everyone, had said it anyway. "You need a husband, Evie, a partner, someone strong enough to share the load." Evelyn had laughed then, a bitter sound that held no humor whatsoever. "A husband? Like Thomas? Like the man who promised to stand beside me and then ran off the second things got hard? That kind of husband? Not all men are Thomas." "No," Evelyn had agreed, standing from the table. "Some are worse. Some are like Father, who worked himself into an early grave for this land and left Mama and me to pick up the pieces. Some are like Judge Harrington, who tried to force me to sell at auction. Some are like Walter Briggs, who circles this place like a vulture waiting for me to fail." She'd fixed her sister with a hard stare. "Tell me, Clara, which kind of husband should I get? Because from where I'm standing, they all take more than they give." Clara had left the next morning, defeated but not deterred, and Evelyn had thought that was the end of it. She'd been wrong. The letter had arrived 4 weeks ago, delivered by the stuttering young man who ran the post office in town. Evelyn had recognized Clara's handwriting immediately, and for a moment she'd considered throwing it in the stove unopened. She wished now that she had. "Dearest Evie, please don't be angry. I know you told me not to interfere, but I couldn't stand by and watch you destroy yourself for that ranch. You deserve happiness. You deserve help. You deserve a chance at love. I placed an advertisement in the Denver Post seeking a hardworking, honest man for marriage. I received 17 replies. I chose the best one, a man named Caleb Mercer. He's 31 years old, a carpenter and rancher from Wyoming. He lost his family 2 years ago and has been working odd jobs ever since. He sounds kind, Evie, and decent, and lonely, just like you. He'll arrive on the afternoon train on September 15th. I've already sent him your address and a photograph. All you have to do is meet him. Just meet him. If you don't like him, send him away. But please, please give yourself a chance. I love you more than you know. Your sister, Clara P.S. I used the money grandmother left me to pay for his train ticket. It's already done. He's already coming. Evelyn had stood in her kitchen, that letter trembling in her hands, and screamed. Not words, just raw fury and frustration that echoed through the empty house and sent the barn cats scattering. How dare Clara? How dare she meddle in affairs that weren't hers to touch? How dare she sell the fantasy that some stranger could ride in like a hero from a dime novel and somehow make everything better? Evelyn Shaw didn't need saving. She didn't need a man. And she sure as hell didn't need some desperate drifter looking for an easy meal and a free place to sleep. She'd written back immediately. A single line. Send him away. I want nothing to do with this. But Claire's response had been equally brief. Too late. He's already on his way. His ticket is paid. He has nowhere else to go. And now, here Evelyn stood on September 15th, watching the distant station where the afternoon train would arrive in less than an hour, bringing with it a man she'd never asked for and didn't want. She should go back inside, should pretend she wasn't home when he came knocking, should let him figure out on his own that this was a mistake. But something, maybe stubbornness, maybe morbid curiosity, maybe just the bone-deep weariness of fighting alone for so long, made her stay on that porch, watching and waiting. You're being a fool, she muttered to herself. A damn fool. Behind her, the screen door creaked open, and Mrs. Kowalski emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. The older Polish woman had been helping Evelyn with the house twice a week since Evelyn's mother died, more out of pity than need for the meager wages Evelyn could offer. Train will be here soon, Mrs. Kowalski said in her thick accent. Her round face creased with an expression that might have been sympathy or amusement. Hard to tell with her. I know, Evelyn replied flatly. You will meet him? I'll tell him to get back on the train and go home. Your sister, she means well. Evelyn turned to face the older woman. My sister means well when she bakes cookies and sends birthday cards. This is interference. Mrs. Kowalski shrugged her broad shoulders. Maybe. Or maybe his answer to prayer you too stubborn to say. I haven't prayed in 3 years, Evelyn said. Not since God took my parents and let Thomas make a fool of me. God listens even when we too angry to talk, Mrs. Kowalski replied. Then she glanced toward the horizon where a thin trail of smoke was beginning to rise. The train, approaching from the east. Is coming now. You should go. Evelyn felt her stomach clench. I should let him walk all the way out here and find an empty house. You could, the older woman agreed, but you won't. You too much like your papa, too much pride to be cruel even when you want to be. She patted Evelyn's shoulder with one work-worn hand. Go meet him, say your piece, send him away if you must, but look him in eye first. Give him that much. Before Evelyn could argue, Mrs. Kowalski had retreated back inside, the screen door banging shut behind her. Evelyn stood alone on her porch, the wind pulling at her simple cotton dress, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She didn't want to go, didn't want to see this man her sister had picked out like a piece of merchandise, didn't want to look into the eyes of some stranger who probably saw her as nothing more than a roof and 3 meals a day. But Mrs. Kowalski was right. She had to face him, had to tell him to his face that this wasn't going to work, that he'd wasted his time, that Clara's romantic notions had led him on a fool's errand. With a curse under her breath, Evelyn stepped off the porch and walked toward the barn. Her mare, Duchess, nickered softly as Evelyn approached, her dark eyes knowing. Don't start, Evelyn muttered, pulling the saddle from its stand. I'm going to town, that's all. I'll be back in an hour, Duchess snorted, as if she didn't believe a word of it. 20 minutes later, Evelyn was riding down the dusty main street of Miller's Bend, Montana, population 427, and most of them more interested in gossip than their own business. She could feel eyes on her from every window and doorway. The Shaw girl, they were probably whispering, going to meet her mail-order man. Wonder how long before this one runs off too. Let them whisper, let them talk. She'd stopped caring what this town thought of her a long time ago. The train station sat at the far end of town, a simple wooden structure with a single platform and a ticket window that was only manned when a train was due. As Evelyn approached, she could see a small crowd gathered, the usual collection of curious townspeople, merchants waiting for shipments, and a few travelers with luggage stacked beside them. She dismounted, tying Duchess to the hitching post, and forced herself to walk toward the platform. Her heart was pounding far harder than it should have been. This was nothing. A stranger. A conversation. A polite but firm dismissal. And then she could go home and write Clara a scathing letter about boundaries and respect. The train whistle cut through the afternoon air, sharp and final. Evelyn watched as the locomotive rounded the far bend, smoke billowing from its stack, the rhythmic chug of its approach growing louder with each second. Around her, the crowd shifted and murmured with anticipation. Mrs. Grayson from the general store caught Evelyn's eye and offered a knowing smile that made Evelyn want to turn around and ride home immediately. Sheriff Dalton tipped his hat in greeting, his mustache twitching with barely suppressed amusement. They all knew. Of course they all knew. Clara had probably announced it to half of Denver, and news traveled fast on the frontier. The train pulled into the station with a hiss of steam and a screech of brakes, the massive iron beast coming to rest with a final shuddering exhale. Doors opened. Passengers began to disembark. A family with 3 small children, an elderly man with a cane, a well-dressed woman who immediately looked around with an expression of faint disdain. And then, stepping down from the third car, moving slowly as if his body ached, came a man. He was tall, over 6 feet easily, with broad shoulders and a lean, rangy build that spoke of hard physical labor. His clothes were simple and worn but clean, dark trousers, a faded work shirt, a brown vest, and a hat that had seen better days. He carried a single battered carpet bag in one hand and had a bedroll strapped across his back. But it was his face that made Evelyn's breath catch unexpectedly in her throat. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense. His features were too rough for that, too weathered by sun and wind and whatever hardships he'd endured. His jaw was strong and covered with several days' worth of dark stubble. His hair, brown and slightly too long, curled at his collar. His nose looked like it had been broken at least once. But his eyes? Even from a distance, even through the crowd of people, Evelyn could see his eyes. They were a pale, striking blue, the color of winter ice, and they held a depth of sorrow that was almost physical in its intensity. He stood on the platform for a long moment, that single bag in his hand, looking around as if trying to orient himself. His gaze swept across the crowd, searching, and then it landed on her. Evelyn didn't know how he knew. Maybe Clara had sent him her photograph too, though Evelyn couldn't imagine what picture her sister would have used. All the photographs Evelyn had were years old, from before her parents died, when she still smiled sometimes. But somehow, he knew. Their eyes met across the platform, and something passed between them. Not recognition exactly, but acknowledgement. An understanding that they were here for the same impossible reason. He started walking toward her, his steps slow and measured, and Evelyn found herself rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to look away. As he drew closer, she noticed other details. The way his shoulders were set, rigid with tension, or perhaps exhaustion. The careful way he moved, as if his body carried more weight than just the bag in his hand. The fine lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and grief that went bone deep. He stopped 3 feet away from her, and for a long moment they simply stared at each other. Up close, she could see that his eyes were even more striking than she'd thought. Pale blue shot through with gray, framed by dark lashes. Eyes that had seen too much. Eyes that understood loss in a way that made her own carefully constructed walls feel suddenly, frighteningly inadequate. "Evelyn Shaw?" he asked, and his voice was low and rough, like gravel underfoot. "Yes," she said, and hated that her own voice came out barely above a whisper. He set his bag down carefully and removed his hat, holding it in both hands. The gesture was old-fashioned, respectful, and it made something in her chest twist uncomfortably. "I'm Caleb Mercer," he said. "I expect your sister told you I was coming." "She did," Evelyn replied, finding her voice and her anger at the same time. She had no right to do what she did, no right to speak for me or make promises I never agreed to. He nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this. I understand. Do you? Evelyn felt her temper flare, hot and defensive. Do you understand what it's like to have your life arranged without your consent? To be treated like a problem that needs solving by someone else's hand? Yes, he said simply. I do. The quiet certainty in his voice took some of the wind out of her sails. She faltered, her carefully prepared speech of dismissal suddenly feeling hollow. I didn't ask for this, she said, softer now. I don't need a husband. I don't need help. And I certainly don't need some stranger showing up because my sister thought she knew what was best for me. I know, Caleb said. Your sister, she wrote me several letters. She told me you were strong, independent, that you'd probably send me away the moment I arrived. His mouth quirked in something that wasn't quite a smile. She was right. Then why did you come? Evelyn demanded. If you knew I didn't want you here, why waste your time? For the first time, something flickered in those pale eyes. Pain, sharp and undeniable. His grip on his hat tightened, his knuckles going white. Because, he said quietly, I had nowhere else to go. The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest and utterly devastating in their simplicity. Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, to say something cutting or dismissive, to maintain the walls she'd spent years building. And then she saw it. A single tear sliding down his weathered cheek. He didn't sob, didn't make a sound. His face remained composed, that careful mask of control still in place. But that one tear traced a path through the dust on his skin, catching the afternoon light, and it spoke volumes about whatever ghosts he carried. He didn't wipe it away, didn't seem to even notice it was there. He just stood there, holding his hat, looking at her with those devastating eyes, and waited for her to destroy whatever small hope he'd been foolish enough to carry with him. Evelyn felt something inside her crack. She didn't want it to. Didn't want to feel sympathy or curiosity or anything at all for this stranger who'd been thrust into her life by her sister's meddling. She wanted to stay angry, stay cold, stay safe behind her walls. But that tear, that single, silent tear undid something fundamental in her carefully constructed armor. God damn it, she whispered, so quietly that only he could hear. Caleb's expression didn't change, but she saw understanding flash in his eyes. He knew. He knew that she couldn't send him away now, not after seeing that grief laid bare. Evelyn stopped, swallowed hard, tried again. I can't promise you anything. I'm not asking you to, he replied. I don't believe in love. I don't believe in marriage. I don't believe in fairy tales or happy endings or any of that nonsense my sister filled your head with. Neither do I, he said, and the sadness in his voice made it clear he was telling the truth. All I can offer is a place to sleep and 3 meals a day, Evelyn continued, her voice harder now, trying to reestablish some kind of boundary. In exchange, you work. You earn your keep, nothing more. That's all I'm asking for, Caleb said. And when I say you're not needed anymore, you leave. No arguments, no pleading. You just go. Agreed. Evelyn studied him for a long moment, searching for any sign of deception, any hint that he was playing some angle. But all she saw was exhaustion and grief and a desperate need for somewhere, anywhere, to rest. Against every instinct screaming at her to walk away, she nodded sharply. Fine. You can stay. For now. The relief that flooded his face was so profound it was almost painful to witness. Thank you, he said, his voice rough. You won't regret it. I already do, Evelyn muttered, but there was no real heat in it. She turned toward where Duchess waited, then paused and glanced back at him. Can you ride? Yes. Good. My ranch is 4 miles west. We'll need to share the horse. The words felt strange in her mouth, intimate in a way that made her uncomfortable. Unless you'd rather walk. I'll walk, Caleb said immediately, reaching for his bag. Don't be ridiculous, Evelyn snapped. It's 4 miles of rough country, and you look like you haven't slept in a week. We'll share the damn horse. For the first time, the ghost of a real smile touched his lips. Yes, ma'am. And don't call me ma'am, she said, stalking toward Duchess. I'm not some delicate lady. My name is Evelyn, or Miss Shaw, if you insist on being formal. Evelyn, he repeated, testing the name, then softer. Thank you, Evelyn. She didn't respond, just mounted Duchess in one smooth motion and held her hand out to help him up behind her. His hand was large and warm and calloused when it closed around hers, and he pulled himself up with an ease that suggested he'd done this many times before. The moment he settled behind her, his presence solid and warm at her back, Evelyn felt her breath catch. It had been years since she'd been this close to a man, years since she'd felt another person's body against hers, even in this innocent way. "Hold on," she said curtly, clicking her tongue to urge Duchess forward. Caleb's arms came around her waist, careful and respectful, and Evelyn tried very hard not to think about how natural it felt, how easy it would be to lean back into that solid warmth and let someone else carry the weight for just a moment. They rode through town in silence, and Evelyn could feel every eye on them, could practically hear the wheels turning in every gossiping mind. By supper, everyone in Miller's Bend would know that Evelyn Shaw had taken in her mail-order husband. By morning, the speculation would be rampant. Let them talk. It didn't matter what they thought. As they left the town behind and headed into open country, the tension in Evelyn's shoulders gradually began to ease. Out here, with nothing but grassland and sky stretching in every direction, she could breathe again. "It's beautiful," Caleb said quietly, his voice close to her ear. "It's hard," Evelyn countered. "Beautiful things usually are." True enough. They rode in silence for a while, the rhythm of Duchess's hooves and the whisper of wind through grass the only sounds. Despite her best efforts to stay detached, Evelyn found herself hyper-aware of the man behind her. The steady rise and fall of his breathing, the careful way he held her, the warmth radiating from his body in the cool afternoon air. "Your sister told me you've been running the ranch alone for 3 years," Caleb said eventually. "She told you a lot, apparently." "She cares about you." "She interferes," Evelyn corrected. "There's a difference." "Maybe," he allowed. "But interference born from love is better than indifference." Evelyn had no response to that, so she said nothing. After another long silence, Caleb spoke again, his voice careful. "I should tell you about my family, about what happened. You have a right to know who you've invited onto your land." "You don't owe me your story," Evelyn said, though part of her desperately wanted to know, wanted to understand what had put that tear on his face. "I know," he replied, "but I'll tell you anyway. Not today. I can't today, but soon. You deserve the truth." Something in his tone made Evelyn's throat tighten. "Caleb, I had a wife," he said, and his arms tightened almost imperceptibly around her waist. "And a daughter, Sarah and Emma. They died 2 years ago in a house fire. I was in town, picking up supplies. By the time I got home..." He stopped, his breath shuddering. "There was nothing left. Nothing I could save." Evelyn felt tears sting her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and was surprised to find she meant it. "So am I," Caleb said. "Every day. I'm sorry." They didn't speak again for the rest of the ride. When the ranch finally came into view, Evelyn felt the familiar mix of pride and despair that always accompanied her first sight of it. The house her father had built, once proud and well-maintained, now looked tired and weathered. The barn leaned slightly to the left. The fences sagged. The fields that should have been full of cattle held only scattered, thin herds. It was a dying place, and she was killing herself trying to keep it alive. "It's more than I expected," Caleb said, and there was no pity in his voice, only assessment. "It's less than it should be," Evelyn replied bitterly. "It's a good foundation," he said. "Strong bones. That's what matters." She dismounted and helped him down, then led Duchess toward the barn. Caleb followed, his bag in hand, looking around with those observant pale eyes. Mrs. Kowalski emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron, her round face split in a wide smile. "So, he came." "He came," Evelyn confirmed flatly. "I am Mrs. Kowalski," the older woman said, approaching Caleb with her hand extended. "I help Miss Evelyn with house. You are the husband?" "I'm Caleb Mercer," he replied, shaking her hand, "and I'm here to help, that's all." Mrs. Kowalski's eyes, sharp despite her age, flicked between Evelyn and Caleb, reading the tension between them. "Is good enough for now," she said with a knowing nod. You look hungry, Mr. Mercer. I make stew. You come eat. Thank you, ma'am, Caleb said, but I should tend to my things first. Find out where I'll be sleeping. All eyes turned to Evelyn, and she felt her face heat slightly. She hadn't thought about this part. Where would he sleep? There's a room off the barn, she said finally. It's got a bed and a stove. Used to be where my father slept when the animals needed watching. It's yours. Something flickered in Caleb's eyes. Relief, maybe, or gratitude that she wasn't expecting him to share her house, her space, her bed. That'll do fine, he said. Thank you. I'll show you, Evelyn said, leading him toward the barn. The room was small and spare, just a narrow bed, a potbelly stove, a chair, and a trunk for belongings. Dust covered everything, and the air smelled musty from disuse. But it had 4 walls and a roof, and that was more than many drifters could claim. Caleb set his bag down carefully and looked around. It's perfect, he said simply. It's a shed, Evelyn countered. It's shelter, he corrected, and privacy. That's more than I've had in 2 years. She wanted to ask where he'd been sleeping, what kind of life he'd been living, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she said, There's a pump outside for water. Meals are at sunrise, noon, and sunset. Miss one and you go hungry until the next. Work starts at dawn. Understood. And Caleb? She paused in the doorway, not quite looking at him. Don't make me regret this. I won't, he said quietly. I promise. Evelyn left before she could say anything else, before the emotion churning in her chest could escape and betray her. As she walked back toward the house, she heard the sound of wood scraping on wood. Caleb, opening the window of his new room to let in fresh air. Through the dusty glass, she could see his silhouette, and for just a moment she let herself wonder what she'd done, inviting this grieving stranger into her life. That night, after a tense supper where Mrs. Kowalski had done all the talking and Evelyn and Caleb had sat in careful silence, Evelyn lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling. In the barn, in that small room off to the side, a man she'd met only hours ago was sleeping under her roof, on her land. A man who'd lost everything. A man who'd shed a single, silent tear on a train platform and changed everything. She should send him away in the morning, should tell him this was a mistake, but even as she thought it, she knew she wouldn't, because that tear had done something her sister's letters and Mrs. Kowalski's urging and her own loneliness never could. It had reminded her that she wasn't the only person in the world carrying grief too heavy to speak aloud. And maybe, just maybe, 2 broken people trying to survive was better than 1. Outside, the wind whispered across the empty fields, and in the darkness, Evelyn Shaw closed her eyes and tried not to think about pale blue eyes and calloused hands and the quiet promise of a man who'd lost everything but still believed in earning his keep. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow she'd establish boundaries and make sure he understood this changed nothing. Tomorrow she'd go back to being strong and alone and untouchable. But tonight, just for tonight, she let herself imagine what it might be like to have someone stay. Dawn broke cold and gray over the Montana prairie, the kind of morning that promised frost before noon and hardship before nightfall. Evelyn woke to the sound of something she hadn't heard in 3 years, the rhythmic strike of a hammer against wood, steady and sure, echoing across the empty yard. She sat up in bed, disoriented for a moment, her heart pounding with the instinctive alarm of someone who'd learned to sleep light and wake ready for trouble. Then memory flooded back. The train station, the tear, the man in the barn, Caleb Mercer. She'd half convinced herself during the restless hours of night that he'd be gone by morning, that he'd taken one look at her dying ranch in daylight and decided whatever desperation had brought him here wasn't worth the effort. Men left. That's what they did. Thomas had taught her that lesson well enough. But that hammer said otherwise. Evelyn dressed quickly in her work clothes, canvas trousers that scandalized the church ladies, a worn flannel shirt that had belonged to her father, and boots that had been resoled twice. She braided her hair with practiced efficiency, splashed cold water on her face from the basin, and headed downstairs. The house was quiet. Mrs. Kowalski wouldn't arrive for another 2 hours, which meant Evelyn would have to face whatever was happening outside alone, without the buffer of the older woman's cheerful interference. She stepped onto the porch and stopped. The east pasture fence, the one that had been sagging dangerously for 6 months, the one she'd tried and failed to fix 3 separate times, was already half mended. New posts stood straight and true where rotted ones had been pulled out. Fresh wires stretched tight between them, gleaming in the early light. And there, working in the pre-dawn shadows with the focused intensity of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts, was Caleb. He'd shed his vest and rolled up his shirt sleeves despite the cold, and Evelyn could see the play of muscle in his forearms as he drove another post into the hard ground. Sweat dampened his shirt despite the chill, and his breath came out in white puffs in the morning air. He worked like a man possessed, like a man who'd forgotten how to be still, and something about the desperate energy in his movements made Evelyn's chest ache. She should go inside, should let him work off whatever demons had driven him out here before sunrise, should maintain distance and boundaries and all the careful rules she'd set for herself. Instead, she found herself walking toward him. He didn't notice her approach until she was almost beside him, and when he finally looked up, she saw the exhaustion in his face. He'd been at this for hours, she realized. Maybe hadn't slept at all. "You're going to hurt yourself," she said, her voice sharper than she'd intended. Caleb wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Good morning to you, too. I'm serious. That ground is hard as iron this time of year. You'll break the posts before you get them deep enough, and then I'll have wasted wood and time." "The posts are fine," he replied, gesturing to the already completed section. "See for yourself." She did, running her hand along the fresh sunk posts, testing their stability with the critical eye of someone who'd learned fence mending the hard way. They were solid. Better than solid. They were perfect. Set at exactly the right depth and angle, the wire strung with professional precision. "How long have you been at this?" she asked. "Since about 4. "It's barely past 6 now." He shrugged, reaching for another post. "Couldn't sleep. Figured I might as well be useful." "Caleb." She waited until he looked at her. "You've been here less than 12 hours. You don't have to prove anything." Something dark flickered across his face. "Yes," he said quietly, "I do." Before she could respond, he'd turned back to his work, driving the post into the ground with controlled violence that spoke of rage, carefully channeled into productivity. Evelyn watched him for another moment, seeing too much of herself in the desperate need to work until the body was too exhausted to think, to feel, to remember. Then she made a decision that surprised her. "Wait here," she said. She returned to the house and emerged 10 minutes later with 2 tin cups of coffee and a plate of leftover cornbread. Caleb had paused in his work, sitting on one of the completed fence posts, his head bowed and his shoulders heaving with exertion. "Break time," Evelyn announced, holding out one of the cups. He looked up, surprise evident in those pale eyes. "You don't have to. I know I don't have to. But if you collapse from exhaustion and I have to drag your unconscious body back to the barn, I'll be extremely annoyed. So drink the coffee and eat something before you kill yourself trying to impress me." The corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. He took the cup carefully, their fingers brushing in the exchange, and Evelyn felt that same shock of awareness she'd experienced on the train platform, the recognition that this man was real and solid, and here. They sat on opposite ends of the fence line, drinking their coffee in silence as the sun finally crested the horizon, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. In the distance, Evelyn could see her small herd grazing, could hear the faint lowing of cattle settling into their morning routines. "This is good land," Caleb said eventually, his voice thoughtful. "Hard, but good. The kind that rewards honest work." "Or punishes it," Evelyn replied. "Depending on the year." "Your father built all this?" "Every fence post, every board in that barn, every stone in the house foundation. He came out here with nothing but a wagon and a dream and my mother's faith." Her voice went tight. "Worked himself into an early grave for it. But he left you something worth fighting for," Caleb said. "That's not nothing." "It's not enough either." The words came out more bitter than she'd intended. "A legacy of debt and broken dreams. Some inheritance." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the rising sun. "My father left me a watch," he said finally. "Brass badly tarnished, kept terrible time. But it was his, so I carried it every day." He paused, his jaw working. "It was in my pocket the day my house burned. Only thing that survived." "Where is it now?" Evelyn asked, then immediately regretted the question. Too personal, too intimate. Sold it in Cheyenne, Caleb replied flatly. Needed the train fare. Figured my father would understand. He was always a practical man. He drained the last of his coffee. But I think about it sometimes. Wonder if the person who bought it knows they're carrying a ghost. Evelyn had no response to that, no comfort to offer that wouldn't sound hollow. So she just sat with him in the growing light, two people carrying ghosts, drinking coffee on a dying ranch in the middle of nowhere. The cornbread's getting cold, she said finally, nodding toward the untouched plate between them. Caleb picked up a piece and bit into it, and something in his face changed, softened just slightly. This is good. Mrs. Kowalski made it. She's a better cook than I am. You didn't make the coffee? I did. Then you're not as bad as you think. He finished the cornbread in 3 bites and reached for another piece. When's the last time you had a decent breakfast? I eat, Evelyn said defensively. That's not what I asked. She stood abruptly, gathering the cups. The cows need feeding. There's grain in the barn, about 2 scoops per animal. Can you handle that while I check the water troughs? Yes. He stood as well, rolling his shoulders. But Evelyn, what? Thank you. For the coffee and for not sending me away. She wanted to tell him not to thank her yet, that she still might change her mind, that nothing about this arrangement was permanent. Instead, she just nodded and walked away, feeling his eyes on her back the whole way to the barn. The morning passed in the strange rhythm of 2 people learning to work around each other. Caleb finished the fence with quiet efficiency while Evelyn mucked out stalls and repaired a broken stall door. They didn't speak much, but there was a certain comfort in the parallel labor, in the knowledge that someone else was shouldering part of the burden. When Mrs. Kowalski arrived mid-morning, she took one look at the mended fence and practically crowed with delight. You see? You see? I tell you, Miss Evelyn, good man, hard worker, is what you need. It's one fence, Evelyn muttered, but even she couldn't deny the satisfaction of seeing that section of pasture finally secure. Is beginning, Mrs. Kowalski said firmly. Tomorrow, more fence. Next week, barn roof. You see, good things come. By noon, when they gathered in the kitchen for the midday meal, Evelyn was surprised to find herself almost relaxed. Caleb ate with the methodical focus of a man who'd known real hunger, savoring every bite of Mrs. Kowalski's vegetable soup and fresh bread. He complimented the food, helped clear the table without being asked, and then excused himself to continue working. He is good man, Mrs. Kowalski said the moment he was out of earshot. Sad, yes, but good. You can tell that from one morning? Evelyn asked skeptically. I can tell from eyes and hands, and the way he say thank you like he mean it. The older woman fixed Evelyn with a knowing look. You can tell too. Is why you no send him away. Evelyn didn't argue, because what could she say? That she'd seen something in Caleb's grief that matched her own? That his quiet competence filled a need she'd been denying for years? That she was terrified of trusting anyone but equally terrified of continuing alone? Instead, she grabbed her hat and went back to work. The afternoon brought its own challenges. One of the young steers had gotten itself tangled in some old wire and was thrashing dangerously by the time Evelyn found it. She was trying to calm the animal enough to free it when Caleb appeared beside her. Hold its head, he said calmly. I'll cut the wire. They worked in tandem, Evelyn murmuring soothing nonsense to the frightened animal, while Caleb carefully snipped away the tangled wire. The steer had several cuts on its legs, nothing life-threatening but enough to need attention. We'll need to clean those wounds, Caleb said, examining the injuries. You got any carbolic solution? In the barn. How do you know about I raise cattle in Wyoming, he said simply. Before everything. Had a small herd, about 60 head, lost them along with the house. They guided the steer back toward the barn, moving slowly to avoid stressing the already agitated animal. Once they had it secured in a stall, Caleb cleaned and dressed the wounds with practiced efficiency while Evelyn watched, impressed despite herself. You're good at this, she observed. Had good teachers. He finished wrapping the last bandage and stepped back to examine his work. My wife, Sarah, she was better with animals than I was. Gentle hands, patient. She could calm a spooked horse with just her voice. It was the first time he'd voluntarily mentioned his wife since their conversation on the ride from town. Evelyn felt something tighten in her chest, uncertain how to respond to this offering of memory. "She sounds remarkable," she said finally. She was. Caleb's hand stilled on the bandage. "Emma, too, our daughter. She was 4 when—" He stopped, his jaw clenching. "She wanted to be a rancher like her papa. Used to follow me everywhere, asking 100 questions about everything. Why do cows moo? Where do chickens come from? Can horses really sleep standing up?" His voice cracked. "I'd give anything to hear those questions again." "Caleb, I'm sorry." He straightened abruptly, not meeting her eyes. "I shouldn't burden you with this." "It's not a burden," Evelyn said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "It's your life, your history. You don't have to apologize for remembering the people you loved." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw the raw gratitude in his expression. Most people don't want to hear it. They get uncomfortable, change the subject, act like talking about the dead will somehow make death contagious. "I lost both my parents within 6 months of each other," Evelyn replied. "My mother to pneumonia, my father to a heart that just gave up after she was gone. I know what it's like to carry grief that other people don't want to acknowledge." She paused, her throat tight. "And I know what it's like to keep working because stopping means feeling, and feeling means drowning." Something passed between them in that moment. Recognition, understanding, a shared knowing that ran deeper than words. They were both survivors of losses that had fundamentally changed them, both people who'd learned to channel grief into labor until the lines between the two blurred beyond recognition. "The work helps," Caleb said quietly. "Until it doesn't." "And then?" "Then you work harder." Evelyn felt a bitter smile tug at her lips. "Sounds familiar." They stood there in the barn, surrounded by the smell of hay and animals and carbolic solution. Two people who understood each other in ways that had nothing to do with time or familiarity, and everything to do with the shared language of loss. "Come on," Evelyn said finally. "There's a water trough in the south pasture that's been leaking. Probably need 2 sets of hands to fix it properly." They worked side by side for the rest of the afternoon, and Evelyn found herself gradually relaxing into a rhythm she'd forgotten existed. The back and forth of 2 people solving problems together, the unspoken communication of reaching for a tool at the same moment, the satisfaction of completing a task that would have taken her twice as long alone. Caleb didn't talk much while he worked, but his presence was solid and reassuring in a way she hadn't expected. He anticipated needs before she voiced them, moving with the kind of situational awareness that came from years of hard labor. When she struggled with a rusted bolt, he was there with a wrench. When he needed more sealant, she had it ready before he asked. It should have felt intrusive, having someone in her space, disrupting the solitary patterns she'd established. Instead, it felt almost natural. "You're thinking too hard," Caleb observed, startling her out of her thoughts. "What?" "You've been staring at that trough for 5 minutes without moving. Either you're thinking too hard, or you've discovered the secret to fixing things with your mind." Despite herself, Evelyn felt the corner of her mouth twitch. "I'm thinking that this shouldn't be easy." "What shouldn't?" "This. You being here. Us working together. It should feel wrong, or forced, or uncomfortable, but it doesn't, and that's—" She trailed off, unsure how to finish. "Scary?" Caleb suggested. "Yes." She looked at him directly. "I don't know what to do with that." He was quiet for a moment, his pale eyes thoughtful. "You don't have to do anything with it. Sometimes things just are what they are. Fighting that takes more energy than accepting it." "I'm good at fighting," Evelyn said. "I can tell." There was no judgment in his voice, just observation. "But maybe you don't have to fight everything. Maybe some things are worth letting happen." Before she could respond to that, the sound of hoofbeats interrupted them. They both turned to see a rider approaching fast, kicking up dust as he galloped toward the ranch. Evelyn's stomach clenched with recognition. She knew that horse, knew that rider, and knew exactly what his arrival meant. Walter Briggs. Her neighbor, if you could call someone whose property bordered hers 3 miles to the east a neighbor. A man who'd been circling her ranch like a vulture for the past year, making increasingly aggressive offers to buy her land, hinting none too subtly that a woman alone couldn't possibly manage, and wouldn't it be better for everyone if she just sold out and moved to town where she belonged? Friend of yours? Caleb asked, reading the tension in her posture. Opposite of that. She straightened, her jaw setting in that stubborn line Caleb was beginning to recognize. Stay here. Let me handle this. But Caleb fell into step beside her as she walked toward the house. I'll stay close, just in case. I know you don't need protection, he interrupted gently. But I'm staying anyway. Walter Briggs reined in his horse in front of the house with more flourish than necessary. He was a big man, both tall and broad, with the kind of presence that took up more space than his physical body required. His clothes were expensive, tailored trousers, a fine wool coat, a hat that cost more than Evelyn spent on supplies in a month. Money oozed from every pore, new money that hadn't yet learned subtlety. His eyes swept over Evelyn with the kind of proprietary assessment that made her skin crawl, then landed on Caleb with obvious suspicion. Miss Shaw, Briggs said, his voice booming with false friendliness. Heard you had a visitor arrive yesterday. Thought I'd come by and see if the rumors were true. Mr. Briggs, Evelyn replied coolly, I wasn't aware my personal affairs were of such interest to you. Everything that happens on neighboring properties is of interest, he said, swinging down from his horse. It's called being a good neighbor, looking out for each other. His gaze fixed on Caleb. And who might you be? Caleb Mercer, Caleb said, not offering his hand. I'm helping Miss Shaw with the ranch. Helping. Briggs drew the word out, his smile turning mean. That's what they're calling it these days? Evelyn felt her temper flare. Mr. Briggs, if you have business here, state it. Otherwise, you're trespassing. Trespassing? He laughed, a harsh sound. Your father and I were friends, Evelyn. I'm just checking in, making sure you're managing all right out here all alone. Or, his gaze slid back to Caleb, not so alone anymore. I'm managing fine, Evelyn said tightly. As you can see, now if you'll excuse us, we have work to do. That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. Briggs pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. I've had my property surveyed recently, and it seems there might be some dispute about where exactly the boundary line runs between your land and mine, specifically that water access point by the creek. Evelyn's blood ran cold. The creek access was crucial. Without it, her cattle would have to be driven an extra 2 miles to water every day, effectively halving her grazing range. There's no dispute, she said. My father established that boundary 20 years ago. With a handshake agreement, sure, Briggs said smoothly, but without official documentation. Now, I'm not saying you've been intentionally encroaching on my property. Mistakes happen. But this survey here, he waved the paper, shows pretty clearly that the creek is entirely on my side of the line. That's a lie. It's a legal survey, signed by a territorial surveyor. But I'm a reasonable man, Evelyn. I'm willing to let you continue using the water access for a fee. Say, 5% of your annual cattle sales? Very reasonable, considering. Get off my land, Evelyn said, her voice shaking with rage. Now, don't be hasty. She said get off her land. Caleb's voice cut through the air, low and deadly calm. Briggs turned to him, his expression hardening. I don't believe anyone was talking to you, Drifter. And I don't believe anyone wants you here, Caleb replied, taking a step forward. He wasn't as big as Briggs, but there was something in his stance, in the controlled violence of his stillness, that made the other man instinctively take a step back. Miss Shaw asked you to leave, politely. I suggest you do it before I ask less politely. You threatening me? Just stating facts. Caleb's pale eyes were ice. This is private property. You weren't invited. You're not welcome. Leave. For a long moment, Briggs seemed to consider his options. Then his expression shifted into something uglier. You'll regret this, both of you. That survey is legitimate, and I'll enforce my property rights with the law if I have to. And you, he pointed at Evelyn, you're going to lose everything trying to hold on to this worthless dirt. Better to sell now while you still can. I'd rather die than sell to you, Evelyn said. That can be arranged, Briggs muttered, swinging back onto his horse. You've got 1 week to decide about the water access fees. After that, I'll be posting guards at the creek. Any of your cattle that cross onto my property will be impounded. He wheeled his horse around and galloped off, leaving dust and fury in his wake. Evelyn stood frozen, her fists clenched so tight her nails bit into her palms. Everything she'd been holding together, all the carefully maintained control, threatened to shatter in the face of Briggs' naked aggression. "He can't do that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That boundary has been there for 20 years. My father never would have—" "He's bluffing," Caleb said. "You don't know that. I know men like him, bullies who use legal threats because they can't win fair fights. He wants you scared enough to sell cheap." "Well, it's working." Evelyn turned away, her shoulders rigid. "Without that creek access, I can't sustain the herd through winter. And I don't have the money to hire a lawyer to fight a surveyor's report, even if it is fraudulent, which means we figure out another solution," Caleb interrupted. "There's always another solution." "Is there?" She spun to face him, and he could see tears of frustration glittering in her eyes. "Because from where I'm standing, I'm about to lose everything my parents died for, and there's not a damn thing I can do about it." "You're not alone anymore," Caleb said quietly. "That changes things. One man doesn't change anything. Maybe not. But one man can buy you time to figure out your next move." He held her gaze steadily. "Let me help, Evelyn. That's what I'm here for." She wanted to argue, wanted to push him away, wanted to maintain the fiction that she could handle everything by herself. But the weight of Briggs's threat, combined with the exhaustion of 3 years of fighting alone, suddenly felt crushing. "I don't know how," she whispered. "Then we'll figure it out together." He took a careful step closer. "First, we need to see your father's original property documents. There has to be something establishing the boundary. Letters, maps, something. Do you have his papers?" "In the house. My mother kept everything." "Good. We'll go through them tonight, and tomorrow I'll ride to town and talk to the land office, see what records they have." He paused. "We'll fight this, Evelyn, and we'll win." She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe that someone could actually help, that she wasn't destined to lose everything despite her best efforts. But hope was dangerous, and trust had betrayed her before. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you care? You barely know me. This isn't your fight." "You took me in when you didn't have to," Caleb said simply. "You gave me a place to rest when I had nowhere else to go. That makes it my fight. That's not enough reason to go against someone like Briggs." Then how about this? I've watched enough good people get bullied by men with money and lawyers. I'm tired of it. I'm tired of running. And maybe," his voice roughened, "maybe I need something worth fighting for again." The raw honesty in his words hit her like a physical blow. She saw it then, the truth of what drove him, not just gratitude, but the desperate need to matter again, to have purpose beyond simple survival. "All right," she said finally. "We'll fight, together." Something shifted in his expression, relief and determination mixing in equal measure. Together. They spent the rest of the afternoon in tense silence, both working with renewed focus, but minds clearly elsewhere. When Mrs. Kowalski came to prepare supper, she took one look at their faces and knew something had happened. "What is wrong?" she demanded. Evelyn explained about Briggs' visit, and Mrs. Kowalski's face darkened with anger. "That man is Snake," she spat. "Always he wants what is not his. Always pushing. Your papa, he would not let this happen." "My papa isn't here," Evelyn said tiredly. "No, but you are, and you have your papa's strength." She glanced at Caleb. "And now you have help." That night, after a subdued meal, Evelyn and Caleb spread her father's papers across the kitchen table. Years of correspondence, receipts, maps, and legal documents yellowed with age. They worked by lamplight, sorting through decades of accumulated records, searching for anything that might establish the boundary beyond dispute. "Here," Caleb said after an hour of searching. He held up a faded map. "This shows the original land grant, dated 1862. The creek is clearly marked as the eastern boundary of your property. But is that official enough to counter a surveyor's report? It's a territorial document signed by the land office. That's as official as it gets." He studied the map more carefully. "And look, there are marker stones mentioned here, placed every quarter-mile along the boundary. If those stones are still there, they'll prove Briggs's survey is wrong." Hope flickered cautiously in Evelyn's chest. "I've never seen any marker stones." They might be overgrown or buried, but if we can find them, we could prove he's lying. She looked at Caleb with something approaching wonder. You really think this could work? I think it's worth trying. He rolled up the map carefully. Tomorrow we'll ride the boundary line and look for those markers. If we find even one, we can request a new survey. That costs money. How much? More than I have. Caleb was quiet for a moment, his jaw working. Then he said, I have a little saved. About $40. It's yours if you need it. Evelyn stared at him, stunned. Caleb, that's probably everything you have in the world. It's money. I can earn more. You can't earn more land. I can't take. You're not taking. I'm offering. His pale eyes were steady. Let me do this, Evelyn. Let me help. She wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain her independence, her pride. But pride wouldn't save the ranch, and she'd already lost too much to lose this too. If we do this, she said slowly, if we fight Briggs together, you need to understand what you're risking. He's powerful, connected. He could make your life very difficult. My life is already difficult, Caleb replied. At least this way, it means something. They sat at that table late into the night, planning their next moves, and Evelyn felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not quite hope, not yet, but something close to it. The possibility that she might not have to fight alone anymore. The chance that help could come without conditions or expectations. When she finally climbed the stairs to bed, exhausted but somehow lighter, she paused at her bedroom window. Below, she could see the light still burning in Caleb's room in the barn. He was probably still going through papers, still searching for ammunition in their fight against Briggs. A man who'd lost everything, working through the night to help her save what little she had left. Evelyn pressed her forehead against the cool glass and allowed herself a moment of honesty that she'd never have admitted in daylight. She was glad he'd come. Glad he'd stayed. Glad that somewhere between that tear at the train station and this moment, she'd made the decision to trust again, even if it terrified her. Tomorrow they'd search for marker stones. Tomorrow they'd begin the fight. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Evelyn Shaw went to sleep knowing she wasn't alone. The sky at dawn was the color of a fresh bruise, purple-black clouds rolling in from the west with the promise of violence. Evelyn stood on the porch, coffee cup warming her hands, and watched the storm building on the horizon with a rancher's practiced eye. They had maybe 4 hours before it hit, maybe less if the wind kept building the way it was. 4 hours to search miles of overgrown boundary line for stone markers that might not even exist anymore. We should postpone, Caleb said, coming up beside her with his own cup. He'd been up even earlier than she had, she'd noticed. The man seemed to run on determination and coffee, sleep an afterthought he couldn't quite afford. That storm looks mean. They all look mean until they pass over harmless, Evelyn replied, though she didn't believe it. This one had teeth. Besides, Briggs gave us a week. We've already lost a day. We can't afford to lose another. We also can't afford to get caught out in a storm that could kill us. She glanced at him, saw the concern in his pale eyes, and felt something warm unfurl in her chest despite the cold morning air. When was the last time someone had worried about her safety? When was the last time someone's first thought had been her well-being rather than what she could do for them? We'll be careful, she said. Stay close to shelter. Turn back at the first sign it's getting too dangerous. Caleb studied the approaching weather for another long moment, then nodded. All right, but we do this smart. No heroics. I don't do heroics, Evelyn said. I do survival. There's a difference. They saddled the horses quickly, Duchess for Evelyn and one of the 2 remaining geldings for Caleb. The wind was already picking up, carrying with it the metallic smell of coming rain and something else, something electric that made the horses nervous, and the hair on Evelyn's arms stand up. Mrs. Kowalski arrived just as they were mounting up, and her round face creased with worry when she saw them. You go out in this? You are crazy people. We're looking for the boundary markers, Evelyn explained, the ones marked on my father's map. If you can find them tomorrow, after storm passes, Mrs. Kowalski interrupted. Why you must go now? Because Briggs isn't waiting, Caleb said quietly, and neither can we. The older woman crossed herself and muttered something in Polish that probably wasn't a blessing. Then I pray for you, and I make hot soup for when you come back cold and wet and stupid." Despite the tension coiling in her gut, Evelyn smiled. "We'll be back before you know it." "Make sure you are back," Mrs. Kowalski said fiercely. "Both of you, I am too old to dig graves." They rode east toward the disputed boundary, following the old fence line that marked where Shaw land had ended for as long as Evelyn could remember. The map Caleb carried showed the first marker stone should be about a mile out, near a distinctive grouping of cottonwood trees that her father had noted as a landmark. The cottonwoods were still there, massive and gnarled, their leaves already beginning to turn with the season. But finding anything beneath their spread proved more difficult than either of them had anticipated. 2 decades of accumulated leaf litter, erosion, and new growth had transformed the landscape. What might have been clearly visible in 1862 was now hidden beneath nature's relentless reclamation. "It should be right about here," Caleb said, dismounting and studying the map again. 10 paces northeast of the largest tree, set in a small clearing. There was no clearing anymore, just thick undergrowth and tangled brush. They tied the horses and began searching on foot, pushing through brambles that caught at their clothes and scratched exposed skin. The wind was stronger now, making the cottonwood branches creak and groan overhead, and the first drops of rain began to fall, fat and cold. "Evelyn, look!" Caleb was crouched in the undergrowth, brushing away dirt and dead leaves. "I think I found something." She scrambled over to him, her heart hammering. There, half buried and covered in moss, was a rectangular stone about the size of a man's head. Carved into its weathered surface, barely visible, were markings. The year 1862, and what looked like coordinates. "That's it," Evelyn breathed. "That's the marker." "One down," Caleb said, pulling out a small notebook and carefully recording the location. "Map shows there should be 3 more along this section of boundary. If we can find at least one more—" Thunder cracked overhead, close enough to make them both flinch. The horses whinnied nervously, pulling at their tethers. The rain was coming harder now, no longer isolated drops, but a steady, insistent patter that promised to become a deluge. "We should head back," Caleb said, standing and offering Evelyn his hand to help her up. She took it, letting him pull her to her feet, and for a moment they stood close together, his hand still holding hers, rain beginning to soak through their clothes. Something passed between them in that instant, something electric that had nothing to do with the storm and everything to do with the way he was looking at her. Like she was someone worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth standing beside in the rain. "One more," Evelyn said, not pulling her hand away. "The map shows another marker only half a mile south. We can make it there and back before the storm really hits." "Evelyn, please," she squeezed his hand. "I need to be sure. I need to know we have enough evidence to fight him." She saw the moment he gave in, saw the concern in his eyes yield to understanding. He knew what it was like to need certainty, to need proof that fighting wasn't futile. He'd lost everything once before without being able to stop it. He wouldn't let her lose everything without at least trying. 30 minutes, he said. "We find it or we don't, but in 30 minutes we head back regardless. Agreed?" "Agreed." They mounted up and rode south, following the boundary line as best they could while the storm built around them. The rain was steady now, cold and driving, soaking through their coats and making visibility difficult. Lightning flashed in the distance, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the ground beneath the horses' hooves. The second marker stone was supposed to be near a creek crossing where the boundary line intersected with a small tributary that fed into the main creek. They found the tributary easily enough. It was already swollen with runoff, rushing past with more force than its shallow bed usually carried. "There!" Evelyn shouted over the wind, pointing to the far bank. "I see something that might be it." The crossing was shallow, usually nothing more than a trickle over smooth stones. But with the rain, it had become treacherous, the water muddy and fast-moving. Caleb dismounted and tested the depth with a long stick, his face grim. "It's passable," he said, "but barely. Let me go first. If I make it across, you follow." "We'll both go," Evelyn said, sliding off Duchess. "Leading the horses, safer that way." "Evelyn, we don't have time to argue. Come on." She started across before he could protest further, Duchess following reluctantly behind her. The water was deeper than it looked, coming up past Evelyn's knees, shockingly cold and strong enough to require concentration to keep her footing. Behind her, she heard Caleb curse as he entered the water, heard the gelding snort nervously. They were halfway across when the lightning hit. It struck one of the cottonwoods on the far bank. The crack of impact so loud it felt like the world splitting open. The tree exploded in a shower of sparks and burning wood, and both horses screamed in terror. Duchess reared, yanking the reins from Evelyn's hands, her hooves flailing dangerously close to Evelyn's head. "Get down!" Caleb's voice cut through the chaos, and suddenly his arm was around her waist, pulling her down and away from the panicking horse. They went under together, the cold water closing over their heads for a terrifying moment before they surfaced, gasping. Duchess had bolted back toward the near bank, wild-eyed and terrified. The gelding was doing the same, dragging Caleb's grip from the reins as it thrashed its way back across the creek. "Are you hurt?" Caleb demanded, his hands on Evelyn's shoulders, his face inches from hers as rain poured down around them. "I'm fine," she managed, though her heart was hammering so hard she could barely breathe. "The horses are fine. Scared, but fine. They'll head back toward the barn." He was still holding her, she realized, supporting most of her weight in the rushing water. "Can you stand?" She tried, and her left ankle immediately sent a spike of pain up her leg. She must have twisted it when they fell, though she hadn't noticed in the moment. "I think I hurt my ankle." Caleb's expression darkened with concern. "How bad?" "Not broken, just twisted." She gritted her teeth. "I can walk on it." "Not through this." He glanced around at the storm, which had gone from threatening to actively dangerous in the span of minutes. The rain was a solid wall now, visibility reduced to a few yards. Thunder crashed continuously, and lightning illuminated the darkened landscape in brief, violent flashes. "We need shelter, now." "The barn is 3 miles. Too far. You're already soaked through, and that ankle needs rest, not a 3-mile hike." He was scanning the landscape, searching for options. "There. That rock outcropping. Looks like there might be an overhang. Come on." He didn't wait for her to agree, just pulled her arm over his shoulders and began half carrying her toward the rocks. Evelyn wanted to protest, wanted to insist she could manage on her own, but the pain in her ankle and the cold seeping into her bones made arguing seem foolish. She let him take her weight, let him guide her through the storm, and tried not to think about how natural it felt to lean on someone again. The outcropping did have an overhang, a shallow cave, really, barely deep enough to be called shelter, but enough to get them out of the worst of the rain. Caleb helped her sit down on the relatively dry stone floor, then immediately began checking her ankle. "Can you move it?" he asked, his hands gentle as he carefully probed the swelling. "Yes, it hurts, but I can move it." "Good. Probably just a bad sprain then." He pulled off his coat, which was soaked through but still warmer than nothing, and draped it over her shoulders. "We'll wait here until the worst passes. An hour, maybe 2. Then we'll head back." "You'll freeze without your coat," Evelyn protested. "I'll be fine. You're the one who's injured." He sat down beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Besides, seems only fair. You gave me shelter when I needed it. Now I do the same for you." They sat in silence for a while, watching the storm rage beyond their small shelter. Lightning continued to flash, illuminating the landscape in stark white bursts. Thunder rolled across the prairie like artillery fire. The temperature had dropped significantly, and despite Caleb's coat, Evelyn could feel herself starting to shiver. "Come here," Caleb said quietly, and before she could question it, he'd pulled her against his side, sharing what body heat he had left. I know, you don't need help. But humor me anyway." Evelyn wanted to pull away, wanted to maintain the distance and independence she'd worked so hard to establish. But she was cold and hurt and exhausted, and his warmth was impossible to resist. So instead of protesting, she let herself lean into him, let her head rest against his shoulder, and tried not to think about how long it had been since she'd felt safe. "Tell me about them," she said after a while, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Your wife and daughter. Not how they died, how they lived." Caleb was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then his arm tightened around her shoulders, and he began to speak. "Sarah was a school teacher before we married," he said. "Smart as a whip and twice as stubborn. She taught me to read, actually. I'd grown up working, never had much schooling, but she wouldn't have it. Said a man needed to know his letters. He paused, and Evelyn could hear the smile in his voice. She was relentless about it. Every evening after supper, she'd sit with me at the kitchen table with her primers and her patience, and slowly but surely, the words started making sense. She sounds wonderful, Evelyn said. She was, and Emma... His voice caught, then steadied. Emma was her mother all over again, curious about everything, afraid of nothing. She'd follow me around the ranch asking questions faster than I could answer them. Why does the sun go down, Papa? Where do the stars come from? Can we catch a cloud? Just constant questions from dawn until we finally got her into bed at night. She was 4? Evelyn asked gently. 4.5. She was very particular about that half. Caleb's chest moved with something that might have been a laugh or a sob. The day before the fire, she'd announced she was going to be 5 soon, and that meant she was practically grown up and should be allowed to help with the cattle. Sarah and I had been arguing about it at breakfast. Sarah thought she was too young. I thought she could handle leading the gentler cows to water. We were still arguing when I left for town that morning. He stopped, and Evelyn could feel the tension in his body, the way grief and guilt were wound so tightly together he couldn't separate them. It wasn't your fault, she said quietly. I know that. Logically, I know that. The fire started in the kitchen, probably from a spark from the stove. Nothing I could have prevented by being there. But logic doesn't help at 3 in the morning when I wake up and for just a moment I forget they're gone, and I think I hear Emma calling for me. Evelyn lifted her head to look at him, and in the lightning flashes she could see his face was wet with more than rain. Without thinking, without questioning, she reached up and touched his cheek, catching a tear on her fingertips the way she had at the train station, what felt like a lifetime ago. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry you lost them. I'm sorry too, Caleb replied, his hand coming up to cover hers where it rested on his face. For your parents. For whatever bastard broke your heart enough to make you think you had to face the world alone. For every person who's ever made you feel like needing help was weakness. I don't, Evelyn started, then stopped, because what was the point of lying? He saw through her anyway. Thomas was my fiancé. We were supposed to marry the spring after my father died, but when he realized what kind of debt Papa had left, when he understood the ranch was failing and I had nothing but work and worry to offer, he left. Ran off with the banker's daughter, who came with a dowry and prospects and all the things I couldn't provide. Then he was a fool, Caleb said fiercely. A coward and a fool. Maybe. But he wasn't wrong. Look at this place, Caleb. Look at what I'm trying to save. A dying ranch on played-out land with more debt than cattle. Maybe Thomas saw what I couldn't, that some things aren't worth fighting for. Everything's worth fighting for if you love it enough, Caleb countered. And you love this place. I can see it in the way you walk the fence lines, in the way you talk about your father's legacy, in the way you'd rather die than sell to Briggs. That kind of love, that's worth fighting for. Thomas didn't leave because the ranch was failing. He left because he didn't love you enough to stay when things got hard. The words hit Evelyn like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. She'd spent 3 years telling herself that Thomas had made the practical choice, the smart choice, that his leaving had been about economics and logic, but it had never been about that. It had been about love, or the lack of it, about commitment being easy when life was easy, and meaningless the moment it required sacrifice. I don't know how to let someone in, she admitted, her voice breaking. I don't know how to trust that you'll stay when staying gets hard. I can't promise I'll never leave, Caleb said honestly. Life doesn't work that way. People die. Circumstances change. But I can promise that I won't leave because things are difficult. I won't leave because you need help, or because the work is hard, or because staying requires sacrifice. He tilted her face up to meet his eyes. I've already lost everything, Evelyn. I know what it costs. And I'm telling you right now, this place, this fight, you're worth the cost. Something broke open inside Evelyn's chest, some dam she'd built to hold back hope and need, and the terrifying vulnerability of letting someone matter. Tears spilled down her cheeks, mixing with the rain still clinging to her skin, and she didn't try to stop them. I'm scared, she whispered. Me too, Caleb admitted. Every day I'm scared. Scared of losing again. Scared of caring again. Scared that I'll wake up one day and the pain will be gone, and that'll mean I've forgotten them. He pulled her closer, his arms solid around her. But I'm more scared of not trying, of letting fear make me into someone who just exists instead of lives. And that's what you've been doing, Evelyn. Just existing, surviving, but not living. How do I stop? The question came out small and lost. You already have, Caleb said. The moment you let me stay, you started. Now we just keep going. They sat there as that shallow cave while the storm raged outside, holding each other with the desperate grip of two people who'd both learned that everything could be lost in an instant. The thunder gradually grew more distant, the lightning less frequent, but neither of them moved. For the first time in years, Evelyn let herself be held, let herself be comforted, let herself admit that sometimes strength meant accepting help rather than refusing it. When the worst of the storm had finally passed, leaving behind a steady rain and clearing skies to the east, Caleb carefully helped Evelyn to her feet. Her ankle was swollen and painful, but manageable with support. We need to find that marker, Evelyn said, looking across the still swollen creek. Evelyn, you can barely walk. We came all this way. We're not leaving without it. She gripped his arm for balance. I can make it across if you help me. The look Caleb gave her was equal parts exasperation and admiration. You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met. I'll take that as a compliment. They crossed the creek carefully, the water still high but no longer raging. True to Evelyn's guess, there on the far bank, partially hidden by brush, was another stone marker identical to the first. Caleb recorded its location carefully, then helped Evelyn back across. The walk back to the ranch took almost 3 hours. The horses had indeed returned home, and they had to travel on foot with Evelyn leaning heavily on Caleb's shoulder. By the time the barn finally came into view, the sun was breaking through the clouds, and Mrs. Kowalski was on the porch, her face tight with worry. I thought you both drowned, she shouted, rushing toward them. 3 hours late, horses come back without you. I almost send Sheriff Dalton to search. We got caught in the storm, Evelyn said tiredly. Found shelter. We're fine. Fine. You're soaking wet and limping. And you... She rounded on Caleb. You let her get hurt. He saved me from getting trampled, Evelyn interjected. If he hadn't pulled me out of the way... Mrs. Kowalski's expression immediately softened. Then I forgive you. Come, both of you. Hot bath, hot food, hot tea. And you, she pointed at Evelyn, are staying off that foot for rest of day. No arguments. For once, Evelyn didn't argue. That evening, after she'd bathed and changed into dry clothes and Mrs. Kowalski had wrapped her ankle with firm efficiency, Evelyn sat in the kitchen while Caleb spread out the map in his careful notes. We found 2 markers, he said, both exactly where the original survey said they'd be. That's strong evidence that the boundary has been established for over 20 years. With these locations and your father's original documents, we have a solid case. Will it be enough? Evelyn asked. It should be. We'll need to present everything to the Territorial Land Office and request an official review of Briggs's survey. That'll take time and probably money for filing fees, but I'll sell the mare, Evelyn said suddenly. Duchess. She's worth at least $100 to the right buyer. That'll cover the fees and... No. Caleb's voice was firm. You're not selling your horse. We'll use my savings first. If that's not enough, then we'll talk about other options. But Duchess stays. Caleb, I can't keep taking from you. You're not taking, I'm giving. He looked at her across the table, his pale eyes steady. When are you going to understand that? I'm not Thomas. I'm not your father. I'm not every other man who took and left. I'm here, and I'm staying, so stop trying to do everything alone. Evelyn felt her throat tighten. I don't know how. Then learn, because we're in this together now, whether you like it or not. He reached across the table and took her hand. You stuck your neck out for me when you didn't have to. Let me return the favor. She looked down at their joined hands, his large and scarred from years of hard work, hers smaller but equally marked by labor. 2 people who'd survived losses that should have broken them, holding on to each other in a storm-damaged kitchen in the middle of nowhere. All right, she said quietly. Together. Together, Caleb agreed. Outside, the storm clouds had finally cleared, revealing a sky full of stars. The land was soaked but not destroyed, battered but still standing. Like the people who lived on it, it had weathered another assault and survived. In the morning, they would ride to town. They would file their evidence. They would fight Walter Briggs with everything they had. But tonight, they sat at that scarred kitchen table, planning their battle by lamplight, and Evelyn Shaw realized something that both terrified and thrilled her. She wasn't alone anymore. She had an ally, a partner, someone who saw her strength, but wasn't afraid of her vulnerability. Someone who'd lost everything, but was willing to risk what little he'd rebuilt for her sake. "Thank you," she said suddenly. Caleb looked up from the map. "For what?" "For pulling me out of that creek. For finding the markers. For—" She gestured vaguely, unable to articulate everything swirling in her chest. "For staying, even when staying is hard." Something soft crossed his face, that rare expression that made him look younger, less burdened. "Evelyn, staying with you isn't hard. It's the easiest thing I've done in 2 years." He squeezed her hand gently. "Now get some rest. Tomorrow, we have a fight to win." She went upstairs to bed, her ankle throbbing, but her heart somehow lighter than it had been in years. Through her window, she could see the light still burning in Caleb's room in the barn, could imagine him sitting in that small space, reviewing their evidence, planning their strategy. A man who barely knew her, fighting for her ranch like it was his own. A stranger who'd arrived with nothing but a carpetbag and grief, who'd somehow become essential in the span of days. Evelyn closed her eyes and let herself imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like if he never left. If this partnership born of necessity became something more. If those careful boundaries they'd established began to blur into something neither of them had been looking for, but both of them desperately needed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Briggs wouldn't give up easily. The fight was far from over. But tonight, listening to the rain still pattering gently on the roof, Evelyn Shaw fell asleep with hope curled warm in her chest and the memory of Caleb's arms around her in the storm. Some things, she was beginning to learn, were worth the risk of believing in again. Morning came too soon and too bright, the sun glaring off puddles left by the storm with an almost mocking cheerfulness. Evelyn woke to pain radiating from her ankle and the smell of fresh coffee drifting up from the kitchen. For a confused moment, she thought her mother was downstairs cooking breakfast, the way she used to before the pneumonia took her. Then reality settled back into place, heavy and familiar. She dressed carefully, wrapping her ankle the way Mrs. Kowalski had shown her, and made her way downstairs using the railing for support. In the kitchen, she found Caleb at the stove, scrambling eggs with the focused concentration of a man who'd learned to cook out of necessity rather than pleasure. "You should be resting," he said without turning around. "How did you know it was me?" "Your footsteps. You're favoring the left side." He glanced over his shoulder, his pale eyes assessing. "How's the ankle?" "Manageable." She lowered herself into a chair, grateful to take the weight off her foot. "You didn't have to cook. Mrs. Kowalski doesn't arrive for another hour, and I figured you'd try to do it yourself if I didn't." He slid a plate of eggs and toast in front of her, then poured coffee into her cup. "Eat. We've got a long day ahead." They ate in companionable silence, and Evelyn found herself studying him in the morning light. He'd shaved, she noticed, and his hair was still damp from washing. Without the stubble obscuring his face, she could see the strong line of his jaw, the faint scar above his left eyebrow, the way exhaustion had carved hollows beneath his cheekbones. He looked like a man who'd been running for too long and had only recently allowed himself to stop. "What?" he asked, catching her stare. "Nothing. Just thinking." "About?" She hesitated, then decided honesty was easier than deflection. "About how strange it is having someone else in my kitchen. Someone making me breakfast. Someone who actually stayed." Caleb set down his fork, his expression serious. "I meant what I said last night. I'm not going anywhere. People say that, and then they leave. I know." He leaned back in his chair. "But I'm not people, Evelyn. I'm just a man who knows what it costs to lose everything, and I'll be damned if I let you lose this place without a fight." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted them. Multiple horses, moving fast. Evelyn's stomach clenched with instinctive dread, and she saw Caleb's posture shift immediately, his body going tense and alert. They moved to the window together, and what they saw made Evelyn's blood run cold. Walter Briggs was back, but this time he hadn't come alone. 4 men rode beside him, all of them carrying rifles prominently displayed across their saddles. They weren't pointing them at anything, not yet, but the threat was unmistakable. "Stay inside, bit," Caleb said quietly, his hand moving to the rifle mounted above the door. "This is my ranch, which is exactly why you need to stay alive to keep it." His voice was calm but unyielding. "Let me handle this." "Caleb, please." He looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Fear, not for himself, but for her. "I've already buried people I cared about. I can't do it again, so please, just this once. Stay inside where it's safe." The rawness in his voice stopped her protest cold. She nodded reluctantly, though every instinct screamed at her to stand beside him, to face this threat together. Caleb took the rifle and stepped onto the porch, closing the door firmly behind him. Evelyn moved to the window, her heart hammering, her injured ankle forgotten in the surge of adrenaline. Briggs reined in his horse 20 feet from the porch, his men fanning out in a loose semicircle. In the early morning light, they looked more like a gang of outlaws than legitimate ranch hands, and Evelyn realized with cold clarity that Briggs had brought them precisely for that reason, to intimidate, to threaten, to make clear that he was willing to use force if necessary. "Mr. Mercer," Briggs said, his voice carrying false pleasantness. "Good to see you again. Where's Miss Shaw?" "Inside," Caleb replied. "And that's where she's staying. Whatever you've got to say, you can say it to me." "That's not how this works. This is her property, her decision. And I'm her representative," Caleb interrupted smoothly. "So talk." Briggs' eyes narrowed, and some of the false friendliness dropped away. "Fine. I'll make this simple. My men have been working since dawn, installing fencing along the disputed boundary. As of this morning, that creek is officially closed to Shaw cattle. Any animals found on my side of the line will be impounded and held until Miss Shaw pays grazing fees, at $5 per head per day." "You can't do that," Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. "That boundary hasn't been legally established. My survey says otherwise. And until Miss Shaw can prove different, which she can't, my claim stands." Briggs leaned forward in his saddle. "Now, I'm a reasonable man. I'm willing to settle this peacefully. Miss Shaw sells me the ranch at a fair price, and we all walk away happy. She gets enough money to start over somewhere more suitable for a woman alone, and I get the land I need to expand my operation. Everyone wins." "Except Evelyn loses her home," Caleb said. "Her father's legacy. Everything she's fought for." "Sometimes knowing when to fold is the smartest play," Briggs countered. "This ranch is dying, Mr. Mercer. Anyone with eyes can see it. She's got maybe 40 head of cattle, fences that are falling apart, and debts she can't pay. I'm offering her a way out before winter kills what's left." "She's not interested." "Then she's a fool." Briggs straightened in his saddle. "And you're a bigger fool for encouraging her. You really think you can save this place? You, a drifter who showed up less than a week ago with nothing but a carpetbag and desperate hope?" He laughed, cruel and cutting. "You can't even save yourself, much less a dying ranch and a stubborn woman too proud to know when she's beaten." Caleb's grip on the rifle tightened, his knuckles going white, but his voice remained steady. "The lady said no. That means the answer is no. Now get off her land before I make you." "You threatening me?" Briggs's hand moved toward the pistol at his hip. "Just stating facts." Caleb raised the rifle slightly, not quite pointing it, but making the threat clear. "You're trespassing. You've been told to leave. Montana law says I've got every right to defend this property with force if necessary." For a long moment the two men stared at each other, the tension thick enough to cut. Briggs' men shifted nervously in their saddles, hands drifting toward weapons. Caleb stood perfectly still, the rifle held with practiced ease that suggested he knew exactly how to use it. "You're making a mistake," Briggs said finally. "Maybe," Caleb agreed, "but it's our mistake to make." "Fair enough." Briggs turned his horse but paused before riding off. "You've got 3 days, Mr. Mercer, 3 days to get those cattle away from my creek, or I start impounding them. And trust me when I say the fees will add up fast enough to bankrupt what's left of this operation." He smiled, cold and predatory. "See you soon." They rode off in a cloud of dust, and the moment they were out of sight, Caleb's shoulders sagged. He lowered the rifle and stood there for a long moment, his head bowed, his hands trembling slightly. Evelyn was out the door before she could think better of it, her ankle protesting but ignored. She reached Caleb just as he turned, and the expression on his face nearly broke her heart. Exhaustion and fear, and the aftermath of adrenaline all warring for dominance. "Are you all right?" she demanded. "I should be asking you that." His eyes searched her face. "I told you to stay inside." "Since when do I follow orders?" She touched his arm, feeling the tension still coiled in his muscles. "You were incredible out there, standing up to him like that, not backing down." "I was terrified," Caleb admitted. "The whole time, all I could think was that if this went wrong, you'd be alone again, and I couldn't—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "I can't let that happen." "It won't," Evelyn said fiercely. "We're going to fight this, remember? Together." "He's already started fencing the creek. That means we move faster than he expects." She was already thinking, her mind racing through options and strategies. "We ride to town today, file our evidence with the land office. Request an emergency injunction to stop his fencing until the boundary can be properly surveyed. That'll cost money, and time we don't have." "Then we find a way." She gripped his arm harder. "I'm not giving up, Caleb, and I won't let you give up either." Something shifted in his expression, fear giving way to determination. "All right, we fight. But you're staying off that ankle as much as possible, which means I'm doing the riding today. I'm coming with you." "No." His voice was gentle, but firm. "Your ankle needs rest, and someone needs to stay here in case Briggs tries anything else. Mrs. Kowalski can't defend the place alone." He was right, and Evelyn hated it. "Fine. But you take Duchess. She's faster than the geldings, and if Briggs' men try to stop you—" "They won't," Caleb said with more confidence than she suspected he felt. "I'll be fine. I'll file everything with the land office, talk to the territorial judge about an injunction, and be back before dark. And if you're not, then you come looking for me with that rifle and Mrs. Kowalski's righteous fury." The corner of his mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "Between the two of you, I'm not sure which is more terrifying." Despite everything, Evelyn felt herself smile. Mrs. Kowalski. Definitely Mrs. Kowalski. An hour later, she stood on the porch and watched Caleb ride toward town, the leather satchel containing all their evidence strapped securely to Duchess's saddle. He'd cleaned up, put on his best shirt, and looked almost respectable despite the worn quality of his clothes. If the land office clerk had any sense, they'd see what Evelyn saw. A good man fighting for something that mattered, someone worth listening to. Mrs. Kowalski appeared beside her, wiping flour from her hands. "He will be all right," she said. "A strong man, smart man." "I know," Evelyn replied. "That's what scares me." "Why scary to have strong man helping?" "Because every time I start to rely on someone, they leave." The admission hurt coming out. "My parents died. Thomas ran. Everyone I've ever trusted has either left or been taken. What if—" She couldn't finish the thought. Mrs. Kowalski made a dismissive sound. "Mr. Mercer is not Thomas. Mr. Mercer already lose everything once. He no value of staying. He no cost of giving up." She patted Evelyn's shoulder. "You trust him. Is good. Now come inside. We make bread. Bread is always good for worried heart." They spent the morning baking, the familiar rhythm of kneading dough giving Evelyn something to do with her hands while her mind churned through worst-case scenarios. What if the land office dismissed their evidence? What if Briggs had already bribed the territorial judge? What if Caleb ran into trouble on the road? By noon, 6 loaves sat cooling on the counter, and Evelyn had worked herself into a state of barely controlled anxiety. She tried to rest her ankle as promised, but sitting still felt impossible. Every sound made her jump. Every shadow at the window made her heart race. "You pace like caged animal," Mrs. Kowalski observed. "Sit. Rest. He will come back." "You don't know that." "I know this. That man look at you like you are answer to prayer he too scared to say. Man who look at woman that way does not leave." The older woman smiled knowingly. "You think I am old fool who see romance everywhere. Maybe it's true. But I also see truth you too stubborn to admit. What truth? That you care for him, maybe even love him, though you not ready to say word yet. Mrs. Kowalski held up a hand to forestall Evelyn's protest. Is all right. Love is scary thing, especially for people who've been hurt, but love is also only thing worth being scared for. Evelyn wanted to argue, wanted to insist that what she felt for Caleb was nothing more than gratitude and partnership. But sitting there in her mother's kitchen, surrounded by the smell of fresh bread and the memory of Caleb's arms around her in the storm, she couldn't quite make herself believe the lie. She cared about him. Somewhere between his arrival and this moment, he'd become essential. Not just useful, not just helpful, but essential in a way that went deeper than labor or convenience. She cared whether he came back safely. She cared whether he was hurt or scared or struggling. She cared in ways that terrified her because caring meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant the capacity to be devastated all over again. I can't lose anyone else, she whispered. So you close heart and live half-life? Mrs. Kowalski shook her head. Better to love and lose than never love at all. Your mama, she tell me this before she die. She say, I glad I love Evelyn's papa, even though losing him break my heart. Those years together worth the pain of goodbye. You remember this, Miss Evelyn? Love worth the risk. Always. The afternoon dragged on with agonizing slowness. Evelyn tried to do light work around the house, but her ankle throbbed with every step, forcing her back to the chair by the window where she could watch the road. Mrs. Kowalski made soup for supper, the rich smell filling the house, and still there was no sign of Caleb. By the time the sun started its descent toward the horizon, Evelyn's anxiety had transformed into something closer to panic. He should have been back by now, even if everything at the land office took longer than expected. Even if he'd stopped to talk to the judge, he should have been back. I'm going after him, she announced, standing and immediately regretting it as her ankle screamed in protest. You are not, Mrs. Kowalski said firmly. You barely walk. How you ride horse. How you help if he need help. I can't just sit here. Yes, you can. You sit. You wait. You trust. The older woman's voice softened. I know his heart is, but you must trust he come back. He promised you, yes? Then he come back. Evelyn wanted to believe it, wanted to have the kind of faith Mrs. Kowalski seemed to possess so naturally, but every minute that passed felt like confirmation of her worst fears. That she'd been foolish to trust, foolish to hope, foolish to let someone matter. The sun was touching the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold when she finally heard hoofbeats. She was at the window so fast she nearly fell, her heart in her throat, relief and fear warring in her chest. It was Caleb, riding Duchess hard, pushing the mare faster than was probably wise. Something was wrong. She could see it in the way he sat his saddle, in the urgency of his approach. She was out the door before he'd even reined in, her ankle be damned. What happened? Are you hurt? Caleb swung down from the saddle, his face grim but not defeated. I filed everything with the land office. They've agreed to review our evidence in Briggs' survey, but... He paused, his jaw working. The territorial judge wasn't there. He's in Helena for the next 2 weeks, which means we can't get an emergency injunction until he returns. 2 weeks? Evelyn felt the ground shift beneath her. Briggs gave us 3 days. I know. Caleb pulled the satchel from Duchess's saddle. But I did find something. The land office clerk, a man named Morrison, he remembered your father, said he filed all his property documents properly, always paid his fees on time. Morrison doesn't trust Briggs, said he's had complaints before about boundary disputes that always seem to favor Briggs's claims. That doesn't help us now. No, but Morrison gave me this. Caleb pulled out a rolled paper. It's a copy of the original territorial survey from 1862, certified and official. It shows the boundary exactly where we found the markers. With this in our evidence, Morrison said he'd be willing to issue a preliminary finding in our favor, not legally binding without the judge's approval, but official enough that Briggs would be taking a significant legal risk if he proceeded with impounding cattle. Hope flickered cautiously in Evelyn's chest. Would that be enough to stop him? Maybe. If he's smart, he'll back off and wait for the judge's ruling. Caleb's expression darkened. But if he's desperate or arrogant enough to push forward anyway, we'll have documentation that his actions were illegal, which would strengthen our case for damages. So we wait. We wait, Caleb confirmed, and we prepare for the possibility that he won't wait with us. That evening, over Mrs. Kowalski's soup and fresh bread, they planned their defense. If Briggs tried to impound cattle, they'd document everything: numbers, dates, condition of the animals. They'd ride to town and file formal complaints. They'd make enough noise that Briggs couldn't act with impunity, even if the law was slow to respond. "He's betting you'll fold," Caleb said. "He's betting that a woman alone, struggling to survive, will see his fence going up and his men standing guard, and she'll decide it's easier to sell than fight." "Then he doesn't know me very well," Evelyn replied. "No," Caleb agreed, something warm in his pale eyes. "He really doesn't." Mrs. Kowalski left with promises to return early the next morning, and suddenly Evelyn and Caleb were alone in the quiet house. The oil lamp cast shadows on the walls, and through the window the last light was fading from the sky. "You should rest," Caleb said. "Your ankle is fine." She stood, testing her weight on it. It hurt, but it was manageable. "Caleb, thank you. For riding to town, for fighting for this place, for—" she gestured helplessly. "For everything." "You don't have to thank me." "Yes, I do." She moved closer to him, close enough to see the exhaustion etched into his features, the worry he'd been carrying all day. "You came here with nothing. You owed me nothing, but you've given me everything: your time, your money, your protection." "Why?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady on hers. "Because the first time in 2 years that I felt anything other than grief was when I saw you standing on that train platform, looking at me like you could see straight through to my broken pieces and didn't care. Because you gave me a reason to get up in the morning that wasn't just surviving until the next day. Because—" he stopped, swallowed hard. "Because you make me want to be someone worth staying for." The words hung between them, raw and honest and devastating in their vulnerability. Evelyn felt tears sting her eyes, felt something in her chest crack open wide. "You are worth staying for," she whispered. "You've always been worth it, Caleb. You just couldn't see it because the grief was too heavy." "And you?" he asked quietly. "Can you see that you're worth fighting for? Worth staying with? Worth loving?" The question stole her breath. Love. He'd said the word she'd been too terrified to even think, and hearing it from his lips made it real and immediate and impossibly frightening. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't know if I can believe that." "Then I'll believe it for both of us," Caleb said, "until you're ready to believe it yourself." He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his hand. His palm was rough with calluses, warm against her skin, and Evelyn found herself leaning into the touch like a plant toward sunlight. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Me too." His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, catching a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "But I'm more tired of being alone than I am scared of what might happen. And I hope, you might be too." She was. God help her. She was so tired of fighting alone, of carrying everything on her shoulders, of pretending she didn't need anyone. She was tired of safety and solitude and the cold comfort of independence earned through loss. "What if it doesn't work?" she asked. "What if we try this and it all falls apart?" "Then at least we tried," Caleb said. "At least we were brave enough to reach for something real instead of hiding from the possibility of pain." He was right. She knew he was right. Playing it safe hadn't protected her from loss. Her parents had died anyway. Thomas had left anyway. The ranch was failing anyway. Safety was an illusion, and she was tired of living a half-life in pursuit of it. So instead of pulling away, instead of retreating behind the walls she'd built so carefully, Evelyn made a choice. She stepped closer, closing the last distance between them, and rested her forehead against his chest. His arms came around her immediately, holding her close, and she felt his heart beating steady and strong beneath her ear. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Not just for the ranch, not just for the fight. Stay with me." "Always," Caleb promised, his voice rough with emotion. "For as long as you'll have me, Evelyn, I'm staying." They stood there in the lamplight, two broken people holding each other together, and something fundamental shifted. This wasn't just partnership anymore, wasn't just practical cooperation. This was choosing each other, consciously and deliberately, despite the fear and the risk and the very real possibility of more pain. This was the beginning of something neither of them had been looking for, but both of them desperately needed. Outside, the night settled over the ranch, quiet and peaceful. Tomorrow would bring more challenges. Briggs and his threats, the uncertainty of the judge's ruling, the constant struggle to keep the ranch alive. But tonight, in the safety of each other's arms, Evelyn and Caleb allowed themselves to hope. Hope that fighting together was better than surviving alone. Hope that love could grow in the ruins of grief. Hope that sometimes the best things in life came not despite the brokenness, but because of it. Because only broken people understood how precious it was to be carefully, tenderly put back together by someone who knew exactly how fragile those pieces were. "Come on," Evelyn said finally, pulling back just enough to look up at him. "You need to eat something more substantial than trail rations, and then you need sleep. Tomorrow we start preparing for Briggs's next move." "Tomorrow," Caleb agreed, but his hand caught hers as she started to move away, and he lifted it to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles with old-fashioned reverence. "Thank you, Evelyn, for letting me stay, for trusting me, for being brave enough to try." "Thank you for making it worth the risk," she replied. That night, as she lay in her bed and listened to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling around her, Evelyn felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of hope. The knowledge that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. In the barn, in that small room off to the side, Caleb lay awake too, staring at the ceiling and marveling at how much his life had changed in the span of a week. He'd come here expecting nothing more than temporary shelter, a place to rest before moving on to the next nowhere town. Instead, he'd found purpose, direction. And if he was honest with himself, the first stirrings of something he'd thought died in the ashes of his old life. He'd found a reason to stop running. He'd found Evelyn, and he'd be damned if he'd let Briggs or anyone else take that away from either of them. The next 2 days passed in tense anticipation, every hour stretching thin with the weight of waiting. Evelyn and Caleb worked the ranch with renewed purpose, moving cattle closer to the house where they could be watched, reinforcing fences, preparing for whatever Briggs might try. Her ankle was healing well enough that she could walk without limping too badly, though Caleb still watched her with the protective concern of someone who'd learned that everything could change in an instant. On the morning of the third day, Briggs made his move. Evelyn was in the barn checking on the new calf when she heard shouting. She grabbed the rifle mounted by the door and ran outside to find Caleb already on the porch, his own rifle in hand, facing down 6 of Briggs's men on horseback. They'd herded nearly a dozen of her cattle toward the disputed boundary, and one of the men was already dismounting with a branding iron. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Evelyn demanded, her voice cutting across the yard. The man with the branding iron, a heavy-set fellow with a scarred face, sneered at her. "Mr. Briggs's orders, ma'am. These cattle crossed onto his property. We're marking them as impounded until you pay the grazing fees." "Those cattle haven't crossed anything except the boundary that's been there for 20 years, Evelyn shot back. "Touch one of them and I'll have the sheriff out here within the hour." "Sheriff's in Helena with the judge," Scarface replied. "Won't be back for a week, maybe more. By then, you'll owe so much in fees you'll be begging Mr. Briggs to take this worthless property off your hands." Caleb took a step forward, his rifle held loose but ready. Morrison at the land office issued a preliminary finding 2 days ago. The boundary dispute is under official review, which means any action you take against Miss Shaw's property is illegal and actionable. You brand those cattle, and you're not just working for Briggs anymore, you're committing a territorial crime. Several of the men exchanged nervous glances. Scarface hesitated, the branding iron lowering slightly. Mr. Briggs said, "I don't care what Briggs said," Caleb interrupted. "I care what the law says, and the law says you're on the wrong side of it." "He's bluffing," another man called out. "Morrison's just a clerk. He can't overrule a surveyor's report." "No, but the territorial judge can," Caleb replied calmly. "And when he does, everyone involved in this little venture is going to face charges. Is Briggs paying you enough to risk territorial prison?" More nervous glances. Scarface looked uncertain now, the bravado draining from his expression. We're just following orders. Following illegal orders doesn't make them legal, Evelyn said. It just makes you accomplices. Now get those cattle back on my land and get off my property before I do something we'll all regret. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then one of the younger men wheeled his horse around and started driving the cattle back toward Shawland. I ain't going to prison for this, he muttered. Briggs can fight his own damn battles. Another followed, then another. Within minutes, only Scarface remained, his expression dark with fury and humiliation. You're making a mistake, he spat. Both of you. Mr. Briggs doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive. Then he and I have something in common, Evelyn replied coldly. Now get out. Scarface spat in the dirt, remounted his horse, and galloped off after his companions. The moment they were out of sight, Evelyn's legs nearly gave out beneath her. Caleb was there instantly, his arm around her waist, supporting her. Easy, he murmured. It's over. They're gone. For now, Evelyn said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to control it. But he'll try again. He's not going to give up just because we scared off his men. Maybe not, Caleb agreed. But we just showed him something important. We're not backing down, and his men aren't as loyal as he thinks. That changes the equation. Mrs. Kowalski came running from the house, her face pale with worry. I see everything from window. Those men, they try to steal your cattle. They tried, Evelyn confirmed, but they failed, thanks to Caleb. Thanks to both of us, Caleb corrected. You're the one who reminded them about the law. I just backed you up. That afternoon, Evelyn insisted on riding into town despite Caleb's protests. They needed to file a formal complaint about the attempted cattle theft, needed to create a paper trail that would protect them if Briggs escalated further. Her ankle protested the ride, but she gritted her teeth and endured it. Some things were more important than comfort. Sheriff Dalton's deputy, a young man named Pete Grierson, took their statement with obvious sympathy. This ain't the first time Briggs has pulled something like this, he said, writing carefully in his ledger. But it's the first time anyone's had the guts to stand up to him and the evidence to back it up. Morrison at the land office has been talking to everyone who will listen about those boundary markers you found. People are starting to question Briggs's version of events. Will that be enough to stop him? Evelyn asked. Pete shrugged. Hard to say. Briggs has money and influence. But he also has a reputation now, and not a good one. People don't trust a man who tries to steal land through legal trickery. He looked at them both seriously. You two need to be careful, though. Cornered men do desperate things. They rode back to the ranch as the sun was setting, both lost in their own thoughts. Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were sitting on a powder keg, waiting for the spark that would set everything ablaze. Briggs had been humiliated twice now, first when Caleb stood up to him, then when his own men refused to follow his orders. Men like Briggs didn't take humiliation well. What are you thinking? Caleb asked as they approached the ranch. That we won the battle but not the war, Evelyn replied. That Briggs is going to come at us harder next time. That I'm terrified of what he might do. Then we prepare for the worst and hope for the best. Caleb reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. We've come this far, Evelyn. We don't quit now. She squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his steady presence. Together? Always together. The attack came 3 days later, in the darkest hours before dawn. Evelyn woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of horses screaming. For a confused, terror-filled moment, she thought she was dreaming, that her mind had conjured the fire from Caleb's memories and made it her own. Then she heard Mrs. Kowalski pounding on her bedroom door, shouting in Polish and English, and reality crashed down with devastating clarity. The barn was on fire. She threw on clothes with shaking hands, her heart hammering so hard she could barely breathe. By the time she made it outside, Caleb was already there, his shirt soaked with water, his face streaked with soot, trying desperately to calm the horses enough to lead them to safety. The flames were spreading fast, fed by dry hay and old wood, and the heat was already intense enough to make her skin prickle. "The cattle!" she screamed over the roar of the fire. "Caleb, the cattle in the holding pen!" "I've got the horses," he shouted back. "You get the pen gate open. Don't go near the barn itself." She ran toward the holding pen, coughing as smoke filled her lungs, her eyes streaming. The cattle were panicking, slamming against the fence in their desperation to escape the flames. If she didn't get that gate open, they'd either burn or trample each other trying to get free. The gate latch was hot enough to burn her hands even through her gloves, but she forced it open and jumped back as 20 head of cattle thundered past her toward open pasture. One of them clipped her shoulder hard enough to spin her around and send her sprawling in the dirt, but she was up again immediately, scanning for stragglers. "Evelyn," Caleb's voice cut through the chaos. "The hayloft is going to collapse. Get back!" She turned to see him leading the last horse away from the barn, Duchess fighting him every step despite the flames. The mare's eyes were rolling with terror, and foam flecked her mouth. Behind them, the barn groaned like a dying creature, and the roof began to buckle. Evelyn ran toward Caleb, her only thought to help him with the horse, to get him away from the collapsing structure. She was 10 feet away when the roof gave in completely, sending a shower of sparks and burning debris into the night sky. The blast of heat knocked her backward, and she felt Caleb's arm come around her, pulling her down and covering her body with his as burning wood rained down around them. Time seemed to slow. She could feel his heart beating against her back, could hear him murmuring something she couldn't quite make out, could smell smoke and sweat and fear. They lay there in the dirt while the barn that her father had built with his own hands burned to ash in memory. When the immediate danger passed, Caleb helped her to her feet, and they stood together watching the fire consume what was left of the structure. Mrs. Kowalski had formed a bucket brigade with water from the well, desperately trying to keep the flames from spreading to the house. Several neighbors who'd seen the fire from their own properties had arrived to help, their faces grim in the flickering light. "This was no accident," one of them said, a grizzled rancher named Jack Morrison who'd known Evelyn's father. "That fire started in 3 different places. Someone set this deliberately." "Briggs," Evelyn said, her voice flat with certainty. "Can you prove it?" Jack asked. She couldn't, of course. Briggs would have been careful, would have sent men who couldn't be traced back to him, would have established an alibi that would hold up under scrutiny, but she knew, in her bones, in her gut, in every fiber of her being, she knew. Caleb's arm tightened around her shoulders. "We'll rebuild," he said quietly. "Whatever it takes, we'll rebuild." "With what?" The words came out broken. "We don't have the money to rebuild. We barely have enough to feed ourselves through winter, and without the barn—" Her voice cracked. "Without shelter for the animals, without storage for hay, without equipment, we'll figure it out," Caleb insisted. "There's always a way." But for the first time since he'd arrived, Evelyn couldn't make herself believe him. She stood there watching her father's legacy burn, feeling the last of her hope crumble to ash along with the barn, and the weight of it all finally broke her. She sank to her knees in the dirt, her body shaking with sobs she'd held back for 3 years. All the grief for her parents, all the rage at Thomas's betrayal, all the fear and exhaustion and desperate determination, it all came pouring out in great racking waves that she couldn't control and couldn't stop. Caleb went down with her, his arms never leaving her, his body a solid wall against the chaos. He didn't tell her it would be okay, didn't offer empty platitudes or false comfort. He just held her while she broke apart, and somehow that was exactly what she needed. When the tears finally subsided, leaving her hollow and exhausted, she looked up to find Mrs. Kowalski standing over them, her round face set in an expression of fierce determination. "Tomorrow," the older woman said, "we go to town. We tell everyone what happened. We ask for help. You think you must do everything alone, Miss Evelyn, but you wrong. This community, they remember your papa. They remember he helped them when they need. Now they help you." "I can't ask them to, You not ask. They offer." Mrs. Kowalski crossed her arms. "You see. Tomorrow, you see." By the time the sun rose on the smoking ruins of the barn, word had already spread through Miller's Bend. The fire had been visible for miles, and in a community where everyone knew everyone else's business, the news traveled faster than the flames themselves. Evelyn stood on her porch, numb with exhaustion and shock, and watched as wagons began to arrive. Jack Morrison came with lumber from his own property. The Hendersons brought tools and their 3 strong sons. Mrs. Grayson from the general store arrived with food enough to feed an army. One by one, the people of Miller's Bend showed up, ready to work. "Your father built half the barns in this valley," Jack said, clasping Evelyn's shoulder. Time we returned the favor for his daughter. By mid-morning, 20 men were clearing the debris and preparing the foundation for a new barn. The women had set up a cooking station and were feeding everyone who worked. Children ran errands and hauled water. Even old Pastor Williams showed up with a hammer and a determined expression, insisting that the Lord help those who helped each other. Caleb worked alongside them, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cool morning air, and Evelyn watched him integrate seamlessly into the community that was rallying around her. He joked with the men, accepted advice from the older ranchers, and worked with the tireless determination of someone who understood what it meant to rebuild from ashes. "That man of yours is something special," Mrs. Henderson said, appearing beside Evelyn with a cup of coffee. "Heard he stood up to Briggs 3 times now. Takes courage to face down a man like that." "He's not my—" Evelyn started, then stopped. Because wasn't he? Hadn't they already crossed that invisible line from partnership into something deeper? "Yes," she said instead. "He is special." "Then you better hold on to him," Mrs. Henderson advised. "Good men who know how to stay are rarer than gold." By that afternoon, Sheriff Dalton arrived from Helena, riding hard with the territorial judge beside him. They dismounted at the smoking ruins, and the judge, a silver-haired man named Thurston, surveyed the damage with a grim expression. "I heard about this fire before I was 3 miles outside of town," he said. "Half the territory is talking about it, and about Walter Briggs' attempts to force a sale." He turned to Evelyn. "Miss Shaw, I've reviewed the evidence you submitted to the land office. I've also examined Briggs' survey and interviewed the surveyor who prepared it. Would you like to know what I found?" Evelyn's heart was in her throat. "Yes, sir." "The survey was falsified," Judge Thurston said bluntly. The surveyor admitted under questioning that Briggs paid him to place the boundary in Briggs's favor, despite evidence to the contrary. The boundary markers you and Mr. Mercer discovered confirmed the original 1862 survey. This land, including the creek access, belongs to you without question. Relief hit Evelyn so hard she swayed on her feet. Caleb was there instantly, steadying her, his hand warm on her back. "As for the fire," the judge continued, "we have witness testimony placing 3 of Briggs' men in the area around the time it started. Combined with the obvious pattern of harassment and attempted theft, I'm issuing a warrant for Walter Briggs' arrest on charges of arson, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted theft of property." "He won't like that," Sheriff Dalton said, but he was smiling. "Man's got an ego the size of Montana." "Then it's time someone taught him that the law applies to everyone, regardless of how much land they own," Judge Thurston replied. He turned back to Evelyn. "I'm also ruling that Briggs is liable for damages. The cost of rebuilding your barn, replacing any lost equipment, and compensating for the distress he's caused. It won't be immediate. These things take time. But you will be made whole, Miss Shaw. That's a promise." Evelyn couldn't speak around the lump in her throat. After years of fighting alone, after all the losses and setbacks and moments of near defeat, justice was finally, impossibly, on her side. "Thank you," she managed. "Thank you." The judge tipped his hat to her, then to Caleb. "Take care of this place, both of you, and take care of each other. That's the real secret to surviving out here, knowing when to rely on someone else." The arrest of Walter Briggs sent shockwaves through the territory. A man of his wealth and influence being held accountable for his actions was rare enough to be remarkable, and the story spread like wildfire. Some said it was about time someone stood up to him. Others muttered about overreach and government interference. But everyone agreed on one thing: Evelyn Shaw and the stranger who'd arrived on the train had done the impossible. The barn raising continued through the following week. What had started as neighbors helping neighbors grew into something larger. A community statement that they took care of their own. Men who barely knew Evelyn showed up to help because they'd known her father, or because they'd heard about her fight against Briggs, or simply because it was the right thing to do. Caleb worked from sunrise to sunset, his carpentry skills evident in every joint and beam. He'd done this before, Evelyn realized, built structures with his own hands, created something lasting from raw materials. It was another piece of his history, another glimpse into the life he'd lost. "You're good at this," she said one evening, watching him plane a board with practiced strokes. "My father was a carpenter," Caleb replied without looking up. "Taught me the trade before I decided ranching was more my speed." but the skills stuck. He paused, running his hand along the smooth wood. I built my house in Wyoming, the one that burned. Sarah and I designed it together, where the windows should go, how many rooms we'd need for the children we hope to have. Took me 8 months to finish it. His jaw clenched. It stood for less than 3 years. Evelyn moved beside him, her hand covering his on the board. I'm sorry. Don't be. He turned his hand over, lacing their fingers together. Building this barn, it's helping, giving me something good to associate with the skills instead of just loss. That's a gift, Evelyn. One I didn't know I needed. You've given me so much more, she said quietly. You've given me hope and partnership and the courage to believe that maybe I don't have to do everything alone. Caleb set down the plane and turned to face her fully, his pale eyes intense in the fading light. I came here with nothing. A bag of clothes and grief so heavy I could barely stand upright. I expected to work a few months, maybe a season, then move on to the next nowhere town. But somewhere between that train platform and this moment, this place became home. You became home. Her breath caught. Caleb, I love you, Evelyn, he said, the words simple and devastating. I didn't mean to, didn't plan for it, but I do. I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you refuse to give up even when any sane person would. I love the way you care for this land like it's a living thing. I love that you let me stay when you had every reason to send me away. He cupped her face in his hands. I love you, and I'm asking you to let me stay. Not as hired help, not as temporary partnership, but as your husband, if you'll have me. Tears spilled down Evelyn's cheeks, but for once they were good tears, happy tears, tears born of joy instead of grief. You're sure? Because I come with debt and struggle and a half-rebuilt barn. I come with trauma and trust issues, and a community that's going to watch our every move. I come with everything I want, Caleb interrupted gently. You come with everything I want, Evelyn. The good, the bad, the beautiful, and the broken. All of it. I want all of it. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. I love you too, Caleb Mercer. I love you for staying when staying was hard. I love you for fighting for this place like it's yours. I love you for seeing my broken pieces and not running away. She rose on her toes and kissed him, soft and sweet and full of promise. I love you for making me believe in second chances. He pulled her close, his arms tight around her, and Evelyn felt something she hadn't felt since before her parents died. Complete. Not because Caleb completed her in some fairy tale sense, but because together they were stronger than either could be alone. Two people who'd survived their own private hells, building something new from the ashes. They were married 3 weeks later, on a Sunday morning with the whole community gathered to witness. Pastor Williams performed the ceremony on the porch of the ranch house, with the newly completed barn standing proud in the background, a testament to what could be accomplished when people work together. Evelyn wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in a trunk and only slightly yellowed with age. Caleb wore a new suit that Mrs. Kowalski had somehow convinced him to buy, though he looked uncomfortable in the formal clothes. Clara arrived from Denver, tears streaming down her face as she watched her sister marry the man she'd picked from a stack of letters. I knew it, Clara whispered during the vows. I knew he was the right one. You got lucky, Evelyn whispered back, but she was smiling. But thank you for being brave enough to meddle when I was too stubborn to ask for help. The celebration that followed was simple but joyful. Mrs. Kowalski had prepared enough food to feed the entire town, and someone had brought a fiddle, and soon the yard was full of music and dancing and laughter. Evelyn danced with her new husband under the Montana sky, his arms strong around her, his eyes full of love and promise. Happy? He murmured. Terrified, she admitted. But yes, happy. Good terrified or bad terrified? Good terrified. The kind that comes from knowing something matters enough to lose. She looked up at him. I'm scared of how much I love you, scared of what it would mean to lose you, but I'm more grateful to have you than I am scared of losing you. Does that make sense? Perfect sense, Caleb said, because I feel exactly the same way. Winter came early that year, but the ranch was ready for it. The new barn stood strong against the wind, the cattle were healthy and well fed, and the house was warm with love and laughter. Briggs was in territorial prison awaiting trial, his property seized to pay damages. The community had rallied around Evelyn and Caleb, and business was slowly improving. But the real change came on a February morning when Evelyn woke feeling nauseous and strange. Mrs. Kowalski took one look at her and started laughing, that knowing laugh of a woman who'd seen this before. "You are pregnant," she announced. "I know this look. I have 8 children. I know pregnant." Evelyn's hand went to her stomach, shock and wonder flooding through her in equal measure. "I can't be. We've only been married 4 months." "4 months is plenty time," Mrs. Kowalski said, still grinning. "You tell your husband. He will be so happy." She was right. When Evelyn told Caleb that evening, his face went through a series of emotions so fast she couldn't track them all. Shock, joy, fear, and finally a fierce protectiveness that made her eyes sting with tears. "A baby," he whispered, his hand covering hers on her stomach. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Evelyn asked, suddenly uncertain. "I know this changes everything. I know you lost." "I lost Emma," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. "And that will always hurt. But this—" his hand pressed gently against where their child grew. "This isn't replacing her. This is proof that life continues, that love can survive grief, that we can build something beautiful from broken pieces." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "I'm terrified, Evelyn, but I'm also happier than I've been in years. Thank you. Thank you for giving me this." Their daughter was born in October, as the leaves turned gold and the first frost kissed the prairie grass. They named her Sarah Emma Mercer, honoring the past while embracing the future. She had her father's pale blue eyes and her mother's stubborn determination, evident from the moment she entered the world with a lusty cry that echoed through the house. Caleb held his daughter with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face, and Evelyn watched him fall in love all over again. Watched him make peace with his past by embracing his present. Watched him transform from a broken man who'd arrived with nothing into a father, a husband, a rancher who'd built a life worth living from the ashes of loss. The ranch thrived under their joint management. Caleb's carpentry skills brought in extra income, and Evelyn's stubborn determination kept the cattle healthy and the land productive. They hired help when they needed it, accepted support when it was offered, and slowly, surely, built something lasting. Years passed. Sarah Emma grew into a precocious child who asked constant questions and followed her father everywhere, just like the daughter he'd lost once upon a time. They had 2 more children, a son named Thomas after Evelyn's father, and another daughter they called Clara, after the sister whose meddling had brought them together. On their 5th anniversary, Caleb and Evelyn sat on the porch in the evening light, watching their children play in the yard. The ranch was prosperous now, the debt paid off, the fences strong, the barn full of healthy cattle, everything her parents had dreamed of and more. "Do you ever think about that day at the train station?" Evelyn asked, her hand in his. "Every day," Caleb admitted. "I think about how close I came to giving up entirely. How if your sister hadn't written that letter, if you hadn't let me stay despite every instinct telling you not to, I'd probably be dead in a ditch somewhere." "Don't say that." "It's true, though." He squeezed her hand. "I was barely surviving, Evelyn, just going through motions, waiting for something to happen that would let me stop fighting. Then I saw you standing on that platform, looking fierce and angry and alive, and something in me woke up, something that had been asleep since the fire." "I saw you cry," Evelyn said softly. "One tear sliding down your cheek, and it broke something in me. Made me remember that I wasn't the only person in the world carrying grief too heavy to name." "That tear saved my life," Caleb said, "because it made you see me as human instead of a threat, made you give me a chance I didn't deserve." "You deserved it," Evelyn corrected. "You deserved everything good that's happened since. And I deserve to have someone who stayed when staying got hard." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "We saved each other, I think. Neither of us could have done this alone." "No," Caleb agreed. "We couldn't. But together," he gestured at the ranch, at their children, at the life they'd built. "Together, We can do anything. Sarah Emma ran up to the porch, her face flushed with excitement. Papa, Mama, look what I found. She held out a small stone, carved with numbers and letters. Is this important? Caleb took the stone carefully, turning it over in his hands, and Evelyn saw recognition dawn in his eyes. This is one of the boundary markers, the ones your mama and I found when we were fighting to save the ranch. Why were you fighting? Sarah Emma asked, her blue eyes wide. Because some things are worth fighting for, Evelyn said. This land, this family, the people we love. Sometimes you have to stand up for what matters, even when it's scary. Were you scared? Their daughter asked. Terrified, Caleb admitted. But your mama was brave enough for both of us. She taught me that being scared doesn't mean giving up. It means caring enough about something to fight for it despite the fear. Sarah Emma considered this seriously, then nodded. When I grow up, I want to be brave like you. You already are, Evelyn said, pulling her daughter close. Just by being here, you're brave. You're our second chance, sweetheart. You and your brother and sister. You're proof that love can survive anything. Later that night, after the children were asleep and the ranch was quiet, Caleb and Evelyn stood together in the barn the community had built, the barn that represented everything they'd overcome. Moonlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the solid beams and careful joints. I never thanked you properly, Evelyn said. For what? For that day you arrived, for seeing past my anger and fear to the person underneath, for staying when I gave you every reason to leave, for fighting for this place like it was yours, for loving me despite all my broken pieces. Your broken pieces are what make you beautiful, Caleb said. They're what taught you strength and compassion and the ability to survive anything. I didn't fall in love with some perfect version of you. I fell in love with the real you, complicated and stubborn and absolutely extraordinary. I love you, Evelyn whispered. Then, now, always, for as long as we both shall live. And beyond, Caleb added, because some loves survive even death. I know that now. Sarah and Emma, they're still with me. They always will be. But so are you and our children. And that's the miracle, Evelyn. That the heart can hold both grief and joy, both loss and love, both past and present without diminishing either one. They stood there in the barn, two people who'd found each other in their darkest moments and built something beautiful from shared pain. Outside, the Montana wind whispered across the prairie grass. Inside, their children slept safe and warm, and between them flowed the kind of love that only comes from weathering storms together, deep and tested and absolutely unbreakable. The ranch that had nearly died was thriving. The woman who'd sworn never to trust again had opened her heart. The man who'd lost everything had found a reason to live. And it all started with a stranger's tear on a train platform and a chance that neither of them had been looking for, but both had been desperately, unknowingly, searching for all along. Sometimes, Evelyn thought, as she and Caleb walked hand in hand back to the house, the best things in life come when you're not looking for them. When you're too busy surviving to notice that rescue might be arriving on the afternoon train, dusty and tired and carrying grief you recognize because it mirrors your own. Sometimes love doesn't announce itself with trumpets and fanfare. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in work boots and a worn shirt, and asks nothing more than a chance to prove itself worthy of staying. And sometimes, just sometimes, the people brave enough to take that chance find everything they never knew they needed. As they reached the porch, Caleb paused and looked back at the ranch, at the barn standing proud against the night sky, at the corrals full of healthy cattle, at the land that had been saved through determination and community and love. Thank you, he said simply. For what? For being brave enough to let a stranger stay. For seeing past my grief to the person I could become again. For giving me a home when I'd lost mine. For everything, Evelyn. For absolutely everything. She rose on her toes and kissed him, soft and sweet and full of 5 years of love earned and tested and proven true. Thank you for teaching me that needing someone isn't weakness, that accepting help is strength. That love is always worth the risk, even when the risk feels unbearable. They went inside together, closing the door on the Montana night, and somewhere in the house, a child cried out from a dream. They went to comfort her together, the way they did everything, as partners, as equals, as two people who'd learned that the strongest foundations are built on shared vulnerability and the courage to try again. The stranger from the train had become a husband, a father, a pillar of the community. The woman who'd needed no one had learned to lean on someone and found herself stronger for it. And the ranch that had nearly been lost became a testament to what's possible when people refuse to give up. On the land, on each other, on the possibility that brokenness can be the beginning of something beautiful instead of the end. Years later, when their grandchildren asked about how they'd met, Evelyn and Caleb would sit on that same porch and tell the story. About a mail-order arrangement neither had wanted, about a tear that changed everything, about a storm that brought them together, about a fight that taught them to stand as one, about love that grew in the ruins of grief and proved strong enough to weather anything. The moral of the story, Caleb would always say at the end, his arm around Evelyn's still strong shoulders, is that sometimes the best things in life come from the places we least expect, and sometimes the people who save us are the ones we almost turned away. And sometimes, Evelyn would add, her hand covering his, the bravest thing you can do is let someone in, even when everything in you is screaming to stay safe, stay closed, stay alone, because being alone is easy. But being loved, truly, deeply, lastingly loved, that takes courage, and it's worth every terrifying moment. Their story became legend in Miller's Bend, told and retold until truth blurred with myth. But the core remained unchanged. Two broken people had found each other in impossible circumstances and built something lasting from shared pain. They'd proven that love could survive grief, that trust could be rebuilt, that second chances were possible for those brave enough to reach for them. And it all started with a tear at a train station, a woman stubborn enough to take a chance, a man desperate enough to stay, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with falling, but with standing back up together.